Watch this space. These are the journalisms by way of aggregation, illuminated from the research of a historiographer, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Your engagement through a like, a share, and a subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission, to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
Engage impulse engines. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Captain. Engage emergency override.
Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage forward shields, 35%.
Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them. Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage.
Corruption resurfaces, and Scotland's First Minister resigns. Watch this space. Syria blasts misleading OPCW report on alleged Duma attack. The OPCW was revealed to have suppressed findings in its initial report that suggested that the Duma attack never took place. Syria made a statement on 28 January rejecting the report issued a day earlier by the Investigation and Identification Team of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons regarding the alleged use of chlorine by the Damascus government in Duma in 2018. Syria totally rejects the report released by the so-called Investigation and Identification Team of the OPCW, the IIT of the OPCW, about the alleged chemical attack in Duma in April 2018. In addition to its conclusions, the country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates said, "Those who prepared this report insist to ignore all the above information or the objective information which was provided by some countries, parties, experts, academics, documented media reports, and former OPCW inspectors with knowledge and expertise, which confirmed beyond any doubt that the Duma incident was completely fabricated," the ministry statement added. The Syrian statement was a response to the new report released by the OPCW's Investigation and Identification Team on 27 January, which, after 5 years, has renewed the accusation against Damascus that the Syrian Arab Air Force carried out the chemical weapons attack on Duma. In April of 2018, Damascus was accused of a chemical attack against civilians in the city of Duma, resulting in illegal U.S. military strikes against Syrian government positions. This was despite the fact that Syria had welcomed an OPCW fact-finding mission to inspect the alleged site of the attack. A year later, WikiLeaks revealed that OPCW had suppressed the initial results of the fact-finding mission deployed to Syria, results which suggested that the incident was in fact staged. That same year, a Mint Press News report revealed that several journalists from a number of mainstream agencies had come to the conclusion that the Duma attack was staged with the help of the White Helmets, a criminal organization posing as the Syrian Civil Defense. This was initially brought to light by a whistleblower from within the OPCW. In 2021, during a visit to Duma, the Gray Zone reporter Aaron Mate referred to the 2018 incident as one of the biggest pro-war hoaxes since Iraq. Since 2013, armed groups in Syria have attempted to pin chemical attacks on the government in attempts to instigate internationally led regime change operations against it. This comes in the form of staged attacks or actual false flag chemical attacks, which leave many dead and are designed to implicate Damascus, as was the case in Ghouta in 2013 and in Khan Sheikhoun in 2017. The latest OPCW report comes as Washington is desperately trying to obstruct the reconciliation process currently underway between the Syrian and Turkish governments. And this is part of an article from The Gray Zone, published on February 3rd by Aaron Mate in Duma. Cover-up, OPCW's new smoking gun backfires. In a new phase of multi-year cover-ups, the OPCW has accused, or of a multi-year cover-up, the OPCW has accused Syria of a chemical attack in Duma. But to make the case, the OPCW breaks its own rules and offers an argument that its own findings undermine. In the latest chapter of an international cover-up scandal, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, has directly accused Syria of committing a deadly chemical attack in the town of Duma. A new report from the Chemical Watchdog's Investigation and Identification Team, IIT, alleges that Syrian forces dropped 2 chlorine gas cylinders and killed 43 civilians on April 7, 2018. The report received an immediate and unequivocal endorsement from the U.S. Department of State, the British Foreign Office, and French Foreign Ministry, the diplomatic branches of the countries that rushed to bomb Syria in response to the events in Duma. The IIT's conclusion follows years of refusal by OPCW leaders to account for the suppression of the Duma probe's initial findings. The OPCW's first report, finalized in June 2018 by a separate fact-finding mission, raised doubts that a chemical attack occurred in Duma. It also left open the possibility that the incident was staged, presumably by insurgents who controlled the area at the time. Leaked documents reveal that this original report was doctored, and along with it, other critical material concealed from public view. The following month, a delegation of U.S. officials lobbied the FFM team to conclude that chlorine gas was used as a weapon in Duma, and that the Syrian government was responsible. A follow-up report released in March 2019 omitted the original's key findings and endorsed the U.S.-led narrative of a chlorine attack. The manipulation of the Duma probe was challenged by OPCW inspectors who developed to Syria for the mission. OPCW inspectors who deployed to Syria for the mission. OPCW Director General Fernando Arias has refused to meet with them or address their concerns. The US, UK, and France have declared that the IIT report refutes the Russian claim that insurgents faked the use of poison gas use in Duma to frame the Syrian government. They also touted what they call the independent, unbiased, and expert work of the OPCW staff. Yet, the IIT report fails to address the concerns of the dissenting OPCW staffers who originally investigated the Duma incident. It doesn't resolve the identified suppression, inconsistencies, and errors across key areas of the probe, including toxicology, chemical analysis, ballistics, witness testimony. Instead, after burying the original findings and stonewalling calls for accountability, for accountability, the OPCW has doubled down on the deception in Duma. The first installment of the Gray Zone's review of the IIT Duma report focuses on the core investigative pillar of chemical analysis, which heavily factors in the IIT's conclusion. And so that's a portion of that article. You can read the rest of it at the Gray Zone. And these are the findings by wikileaks.org. OPCW whistleblower panel on the Duma attack of April 2018. Today, WikiLeaks publishes a statement made by a panel that listened to testimony and reviewed evidence from a whistleblower from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons last week to accompany this statement. WikiLeaks is also publishing a previously leaked engineering assessment of the alleged chemical attack in Duma, Syria on April 7th last year. This assessment was omitted in the final report by the OPCW, which does not support its findings. WikiLeaks editor Kristen Raffson took part in the panel to review the testimony and documents from the OPC whistleblower. He says the panel was presented with evidence that cast doubt on the integrity of the OPCW. Although the whistleblower was not ready to step forward and or present documents to the public, WikiLeaks believes it's now of utmost interest for the public to see everything that was collected by the fact-finding mission on Duma and all scientific reports written in relation to the investigation. We call out to people within the OPCW to leak these documents securely to us via wikileaks.org/#submit. One of the panel members was Dr. Jose Bustani, the first Director General of the OPCW, concluded that the convincing evidence of irregular behavior in the OPCW investigation of the alleged Duma chemical attack confirms doubts and suspicions I already had. I could make no sense of what I was reading in the international press. Even official reports of investigations seemed incoherent at best. The picture is certainly clearer now, although very disturbing. In support of the OPCW's original objectives, the panel called upon the organization to re-establish its credibility and legitimacy by allowing all inspectors who took part in the Duma investigation to come forward and report their differing observations in an appropriate form of the states parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention. And this is an internal OPCW email. He says, the Organization of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons sent a team of experts to investigate allegations that a chemical attack took place in the Syrian city of Duma on the 7th of April 2018. The author of the email was a member of the team and claims the redacted preliminary version of the report misrepresents the facts he and his colleagues discovered on the ground. The email is dated 22nd of June. It's addressed to Robert Fairweather, Chief of Cabinet, and forwarded to his deputy, Amir Shuket, and members of the fact-finding mission to Duma. He says this misrepresentation was achieved by selective omission, introducing a bias which undermines the credibility of the report. Further, it's claimed that crucial facts that have remained in the redacted version have morphed into something quite different to what was originally drafted. This is said to have been done at the behest of the Office of the Director General, a post that was held by Turkish diplomat Ahmet Uzumcu. At the time he has since been replaced by Spaniard Fernando Arias. The attack in question was widely attributed to the Syrian army based on reports by rebel forces that were present in Duma at the time, and this assertion was backed up by the United States, British, and French governments. These three countries carried out strikes against Syrian government targets in response on the 14th of April 2018. This was before the fact-finding team had gained access to the site in Duma. The mission there was delayed for nearly 2 weeks by entrenched fighters and subsequent clashes between the fighters and government forces that moved into the area. Upon arrival, the team found much of the physical evidence, including the bodies of the deceased, was no longer available. It was alleged that 49 had died and up to 650 had been seriously affected by weaponized chemical gas released in a specific area of Duma on that day in April. There was a claim that the gas came from cylinders dropped from the aircraft, clearly implicating Syrian government forces who had complete air superiority. The redacted report seemed to support these conclusions, but the author of the released email outlined some specific aspects of it which he considers particularly worrisome. Firstly, there's a statement in the redacted report. It states that there's sufficient evidence to determine the presence of chlorine or another reactive chlorine-containing chemical. Likely one or more chemicals that contain a reactive chlorine atom. Such chemicals could include the major ingredient of household chlorine-based bleach. Purposely singling out chlorine gas as one of the possibilities is disingenuous. The redacted reporter also removed context from a claim in the original draft which concerned the likelihood of the gas having emanated from cylinders found at the scene in Duma. The original text is said to have purposely emphasized that there was insufficient evidence to affirm this being the case. This is a major deviation from the original report, according to the author. He also cites problems with a paragraph in the redacted version which states, based on the high levels of various chlorinated organic derivatives detected in environmental samples. This is said to overstate the case, according to the email. They were in most cases present only in parts per billion range, as low as 1 to 2 parts per billion, which is essentially trace quantities. One piece of evidence, which was shown on news networks across the world, was a video said to show victims being treated in a hospital in the aftermath of the attack in Duma. The symptoms shown were, however, not consistent with what witnesses reported seeing that day. A detailed discussion of this was apparently omitted from the redacted version of the OPC report. The email states, omitting this section of the report, including the epidemiology, which has been removed in its entirety, has a serious negative impact on the report, as this section is inextricably linked to the chemical agent identified. In this case, the confidence in the identity of chlorine or any other choking agent is drawn into question precisely because of the inconsistency with the reported and observed systems. The inconsistency was not only noted by the fact-finding mission team, but strongly supported the 3 toxicologists with expertise in exposure to chemical warfare agents. Yet another point of contention is the placement and the condition of the cylinders reported to have contained the chemical agent. It's been alleged that their condition may not be consistent with having been dropped from the air compared to damaged in the immediate surrounding area. This was discussed in an unreleased engineering report from OPCW that was leaked and WikiLeaks published in October 2019, and it indicates it's unlikely the cylinders were airdropped. See previous release OPCW whistleblower panel on the Duma attack of April 2018. Sections discussing this are largely absent from the redacted report. This information was important in assessing the likelihood of the presence of toxic chemicals versus the use of toxic chemicals, states the email. The author ends his letter with an appeal to the management to allow him to attach his differing observations to the document. The annual conference of the states parties of the OPCW, that is composed of representatives of all member states of the convention, starts Monday, 25th. Amongst the releases on October 2019 is a memorandum written by in protest by one of the scientists sent on a fact-finding mission to investigate the attack. It's dated 14 March 2019 and it's addressed to Fernando Arias, Director General of the organization. This was exactly 2 weeks after the organization published its final report on the Duma investigation. WikiLeaks is also releasing the original preliminary report for the first time along with the redacted version. The aforementioned memo states that around 20 experts or inspectors have expressed concerns over the final FFM report, which they feel didn't reflect the views of the team members that deployed to Duma. Only one member of the fact-finding team that went to Duma, a paramedic, is said to have contributed to the final version of the report. Apart from that, one person, an entirely new team, was gathered to assemble the final report, referred to as the FFM core team. The new team was staffed with people who had only operated in country X, according to the memorandum. It's not clear what country that refers to, except that it's presumably not Syria. It's possible, though only speculation, that country X refers to Turkey, as OPCW has sent teams into refugee camps there to interview survivors from Duma. The author of the memorandum states that he was the one originally tasked with analysis and assessment of the 2 cylinders found on the scene of the alleged chemical attack. This was the task he undertook in the understanding he was clearly the most qualified team member, having been to the location in Duma, and because of his expertise in metallurgy, chemical engineering, including pressure vessel design, artillery, and defense R&D. He continues, in subsequent weeks, I found that I was being excluded from the work for reasons not made clear. The author explains that he'd frequently asked to be updated on the progress of the final report and to be allowed to review the draft, but was turned down on both counts. The response was utmost secrecy. Once the final report was released on the 1st of March 2019, it became clear that the conclusions of the report had changed significantly in the hands of the new core team that had assembled its final form. At the conclusion of the in-country activities in the Syrian Arab Republic, the consensus within the FF team was that there were indications of serious inconsistencies in findings. After the exclusion of all team members other than a small cadre of members who had deployed again in October 2018 to Country X, the conclusion seems to have turned completely in the opposite direction. The FFM team members find this confusing and are concerned to know how this occurred. Towards the end of the memo, he writes in conclusion, I must stress that I hold no opinion, interest, or strong views on the technical part of the matter, nor any interest in the political outcomes. My interest is in sound technical rigor. The science, engineer, and facts will speak for themselves. And the last portion, part 4. One of the documents is an email exchange dated 27 and 28 February between members of the fact-finding mission deployed to Duma and the senior officials of the OPCW. It includes an email from Sebastian Braha, Chief of Cabinet at the OPCW, where he instructs that an engineering report from Ian Henderson should be removed from the security registry of the organization. Please get this document out of Documents Registry Archive, and please remove all traces, if any, of its delivery, storage, whatever, in DRA. The main finding of Henderson, who inspected the sites in Duma and 2 cylinders that were found on the site of the alleged attack, was that they were more likely manually placed there than dropped from a plane or helicopter from considerable heights. His findings were omitted from the official final OPCW report on the Duma incident. Another document released today is minutes from a meeting on 6 June 2018 where 4 staff members of the OPCW had discussions with 3 toxicologists, clinical pharmacologists, 1 bioanalytical and toxicological chemists, all specialists in chemical weapons according to the minutes. The purpose of this meeting was twofold. The first objective was to solicit expert advice on the value of exhuming suspected victims of the alleged chemical attack in Duma on 7 April 2018. According to the minutes, the OPCW team was advised by the experts that there would be little use in conducting exhumations. The second point was to elicit expert opinions from the forensic toxicologists regarding the observed and reported symptoms of the alleged victims. More specifically, whether the symptoms observed in victims were consistent with the exposure to chlorine or other reactive chlorine gas. According to the minutes leaked today, with respect to the consistency of the observed and reported symptoms of the alleged victims with possible exposure to chlorine gas or similar, the experts were conclusive in their statement that there was no correlation between symptoms and chlorine exposure. The OPCW team members wrote that the key takeaway message from the meeting was that the symptoms observed were inconsistent with exposure to chlorine and no other obvious candidate chemical causing the symptoms could be identified. The third document is a copy of OPCW email exchanges from 20 to 28 August 2018, discussing the meeting with toxicologists. The fourth document is an email exchange from the end of July 2018, where it stated that the 8 OPCW inspectors deployed to Duma during the fact-finding mission should be excluded from the discussions on the project. So there we have it. That's the WikiLeaks portion. And then from First Post, we have an article entitled West Using Chemical Weapons Watchdog to Justify Its Aggression Against Syrian Government, says Russia. Russia's permanent representative to the OPCW has claimed that the latest report by the chemical watchdog accusing Syria of carrying out chemical attack in Duma in 2018 seems to be a political hit piece meant to justify the West's continued military aggression against the Syrian government. Russia's permanent representative to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has claimed that the latest report by the chemical watchdog accusing Syria of carrying out chemical attack in Duma in 2018 seems to be a political hit piece meant to justify the West's continued military aggression against the Syrian government. Alexander Shulgin vehemently dismissed the report, which was released in January by the Investigation and Identification Team, the IIT. Dismissing the IIT as completely illegitimate, Shulgin, while speaking to Russia Today, claimed the group's creation was pushed through by the U.S. and its allies in order to undermine the core principles of the OPCW and international law, replacing them with their own made-up rules. The IIT's report, according to Shulgin, is riddled with inconsistencies and factual gaps and barely holds together. Furthermore, none of Russia's or any other country's uncomfortable questions regarding the details of the IIT's findings were even remotely addressed during an OPCW briefing on the report, the ambassador told Russia Today. Noting that the reporter highlighted the double standards currently present within the OPCW, he said that when Russia presented evidence of a chemical attack in Aleppo back in 2016, every minute detail of Moscow's findings were heavily scrutinized by the organization. However, when it comes to the attack in Duma, OPCW officials seem to turn a blind eye to basic questions such as how and when the evidence was gathered and presented during the investigation, he added. For instance, they refer to the fact that some new sample has appeared provided by third party. What is the third party? Nothing is said about it. They just say, trust us. Shulgin was quoted as saying by Russia Today, noting that the sample in question had never been reported on in previous investigations. So before there was no sample, but now suddenly it somehow appeared. Without any explanations, the ambassador added, suggesting its sudden appearance can only be explained by the need for the US, France, and UK to escape international accountability from their aggression against Syria. What's in the report? The OPCW report finds reasonable grounds exist to believe the Syrian government was responsible for a chemical weapons attack that killed 43 civilians in the suburban town on Duma in 2018. The organization's senior official told the Security Council on Tuesday. According to the report, Fernando Arias, Director General of the UN-backed OPCW, said there's evidence that on 7 April 2018, at least one Syria Air Force helicopter operating under the control of the government's Tiger forces departed Duma Air Base and dropped 2 yellow chlorine cylinders, hitting 2 residential buildings. According to the report, 3 NATO states launched a series of airstrikes against civilian and military targets in Syria in April 2018, after the so-called White Helmets, an NGO operating in so-called rebel-controlled areas of Syria, published a series of videos supposedly showing the aftermath of a chlorine attack on the residents of Duma. Syria has vehemently denied any responsibility for the incident, and both Damascus and Moscow have repeatedly pointed to evidence, including testimonies from alleged victims, that suggests the incident was staged in order to justify a Western attack. And this is from independent.co.uk. In the very early spring of last year, I gave a lecture to European military personnel interested in the Middle East. It was scarcely a year since Bashar al-Assad's alleged use of chlorine gas against the civilian inhabitants of the Damascus suburb of Duma on 7 April 2018, in which 43 people were said to have been killed. Few present had much doubt that the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which represents 193 member states around the world, would soon confirm in a final report that Assad was guilty of a war crime, which had been condemned by Donald Trump, Emmanuel Macron, and Theresa May. But at the end of my talk, a young NATO officer who specializes in chemical weapons, he was not British, sought me out for a private conversation. The OPCW are not going to admit all they know, he said. They've already censored their own documents. I could not extract any more from him. He smiled and walked away, leaving me to guess what he was talking about. If NATO had doubts about the OPCW, this was a very serious matter. When it published its final report in March 2019, the OPCW said that the testimony, environmental and biomedical samples, and toxicological and ballistic analyses provided reasonable grounds that the use of toxic chemical had taken place in Douma, which contained reactive chlorine. The U.S., Britain, and France, which launched missile attacks on Syrian military sites in retaliation for Douma before any investigation had taken place, thought themselves justified the OPCW's report was splashed across headlines around the world, to the indignation of Russia, Assad's principal military ally, which denied the validity of the publication. Then in mid-May 2019 came news of a confidential report by OPCW South African ballistics inspector Ian Henderson, a document which the organization excluded from its final report, which took issue with the organization's conclusions. Canisters supposedly containing chlorine gas may not have been dropped by Syrian helicopters, it suggested, and could have been placed at the site of the attack by unknown hands. So the idea that the canisters were dropped from a plane is in question, and the idea that there was chlorine used and that a chlorine affected the people that were in the area that supposedly died on that day is in question by way of WikiLeaks and Aaron Monte and independent.co.uk, it seems. Peter Hitchens of the Mail on Sunday reported in detail on the Henderson document. No other mainstream media followed up this story. The BBC, for example, had reported in full on the OPCW's final report of the use of chlorine gas, but never mentioned the subsequent Henderson story. And here I might myself have abandoned the trail had I not received a call on my Beirut phone shortly after the Henderson paper from the NATO officer who had tipped me off about the OPCW's apparent censorship of its own documents. I wasn't talking about the Henderson report, he said abruptly, and immediately terminated our conversation, but now I understand what he must have been talking about. For over the past few weeks, there's emerged deeply disturbing new evidence that the OPCW went far further than merely excluding one dissenting voice from its conclusions on the 2018 Douma attack. The most recent information published on WikiLeaks is in a report from Hitchens again and from Jonathan Still, a former senior foreign correspondent for The Guardian, suggests that the OPCW suppressed or failed to publish or simply preferred to ignore the conclusions of up to 20 other members of its staff who became so upset at what they regarded as the misleading conclusions of their final report that they officially sought to have it changed in order to represent the truth. The OPCW has said in a number of statements that it stands by its final reports. At first, senior OPCW officials contented themselves by merely acknowledging the Henderson's reports, the existence a few days after it appeared, without making any comment on its contents. When the far more damaging later reports emerged in early November, Fernando Arias, the OPCW's Director General, said that it was in the nature of any thorough inquiry for individuals in the team to express subjective views. While some of the views continue to circulate in some public discussion forums, I would like to reiterate that I stand by the independent professional conclusion of the investigation. The OPCW declined to respond to questions from Hitchens or Steele. But the new details suggest that the other evidence could have been left unpublished by the OPCW. These were not just from leaked emails, but given by an OPCW inspector, a colleague of Henderson, who was one of a team of 8 to visit Douma, and who appeared at a briefing in Brussels last month to explain his original findings to a group of disarmament, legal, medical, and intelligence personnel. As Steele reported afterwards in a piece published by Counterpunch in mid-November 2019, The inspector, who gave his name to his audience but asked to be called Alex, said he didn't want to undermine the OPCW, but stated that most of the Duma team felt the 2 reports on the incident the OPCW had also published an interim report in 2018 were scientifically impoverished, procedurally irregular, and possibly fraudulent. Alex said he sought in vain to have a subsequent OPCW conference to address these concerns and demonstrate transparency, impartiality, and independence.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
From Tasnim News Agency, the West justifies its aggression by using chemical weapons watchdog Moscow. This is from February 8th. Russia's permanent representative to the OPCW, Alexander Shulgin, said the latest report accusing Damascus of carrying out a chemical attack in Duma in 2018 appears to be a political hit piece meant to justify the West's continued military aggression against the Syrian government. Shulgin vehemently dismissed the report by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which was produced in late January by the so-called Investigation and Identification Team, IIT. In an interview with RT, calling the IIT completely illegitimate, he claimed the group's creation was pushed through by the U.S. and its allies in order to determine the core principles to undermine the core principles of the OPCW and international law, and replace them with their own made-up rules. The IIT's report, according to Shulgin, is riddled with inconsistencies and factual gaps, and barely holds together. Furthermore, none of Russia's or any other country's uncomfortable questions regarding the details of the IIT's findings were even remotely addressed during an OPCW briefing on the report, the ambassador said. Shulgin also noted that the report highlighted the double standards currently present within the OPCW when Russia presented evidence of a chemical attack in Aleppo back in 2016. Every minute detail of Moscow's findings was heavily scrutinized by the organization, he said. However, when it comes to the attack in Duma, OPCW officials seem to turn a blind eye to basic questions such as how and when the evidence was gathered and presented during the investigation.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
For instance, they referred to the fact that some new sample has appeared provided by a third party. What is the third party? Nothing is said about it. They just say, "Trust us," said Shulgin, noting that the sample in question had never been reported on in previous investigations. So, before there was no sample, but now, suddenly, it somehow appeared without any explanations. The ambassador stressed, suggesting its sudden appearance can only be explained by the need for the US, France, and UK to escape international accountability for the aggression against Syria. The 3 NATO states launched a series of airstrikes against civilian and military targets in Syria in April 2018 after the so-called White Helmets, an NGO operating in quote-unquote rebel-controlled areas of Syria, published a series of videos supposedly showing the aftermath of a chlorine attack on the residents of Duma. Syria has vehemently denied any responsibility for the incident, and both Damascus and Moscow have repeatedly pointed to evidence, including testimonies from alleged victims, that suggest the incident was staged in order to justify a Western attack. And here's Vanessa Bealey on the issue.
That you had an Andrew Mitchell video, Mike?
Yes, you wanted to quote Andrew Mitchell, so let's have a look at what Andrew Mitchell had to say on Newsnight a night or two ago.
Okay.
One crossing that's open, that's all as a result of the Russian and Chinese veto. And we've spoken tonight to Martin Griffiths, the head of UN OCHA, to ask what we're going to do. We need to get these other crossings open. And the one that was open, partly because of border restrictions, but also because of the effects of the earthquake, is now shut. So this one route of getting stuff through to northern Syria is currently closed.
Britain's response to the immediate challenge? To help the one organisation that is operating on the ground.
Britain has funded the White Helmets, which during the war were a sort of civil defence unit. But they are the first responders on the ground there, and we are looking at giving them more support so that they can put fuel in their vehicles.
Yeah. Right. So what I've actually been told by sources with contacts inside USA is that the UK and the US right now see this as an opportunity to repair the tarnished reputation of the White Helmets, who, of course, were very much discredited, particularly by their role in staging events during the alleged Duma chemical attack.
What is this nothing you talk about?
Fraudulent witness statements to the OPCW team. And of course, the OPCW has been completely discredited by the dissident inspectors who have exposed the various reports, including the latest identification and investigation team report, which is attributed blame to the Syrian government. Basically, the inspectors demonstrated that the OPCW was being influenced to produce the results that were effectively fraudulent and covering up the crimes of the UK, US, and France that bombed Damascus on the basis of the claim of chemical weapon use. So here we have the US aid Administrator Samantha Power's calls regarding the response to the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, and mirroring the language that we're hearing from UK officials in a call with Raed al-Salah, head of the Syria Civil Defense, also known as White Helmets, and a long-standing US aid partner. Administrator Power reiterated US aid support for the people of Syria and offered condolences for the lives lost. Let's have a look. People who followed the Syria war from the beginning will know our work on exposing the White Helmets, let's say, Oscar-winning performances in their PR complex that was producing these reports to effectively present the White Helmets as Nobel Peace Prize nominees. Let's have a look at this video, Mike.
Of course, Vanessa, one of the most famous photographs from the Syrian campaign, the Syrian war, was Dusty Boy, but somehow that boy seems to have come out with no dust on him whatsoever, Patrick.
Clean as a whistle. And when he was saying takbir, he wasn't talking about let's go to the pub and celebrate. Okay, these are hardcore jihadists.
Yes. So
and I mean, extraordinary, because presumably this boy would have been buried since, what was it, 4 a.m. On Monday morning. And yet, as you point out, he emerges perfectly clean and perfectly...
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
It's quite clear that he knows the people who have dug him out and that he thinks this is a great game. Of course, this is also in keeping with the tsunami of videos that we used to see from when the White Helmets got involved in producing the propaganda in Syria to defend the armed groups and to maintain the idea or the myth of them being moderate rebels. So let's look at how much the US is pledging: 85 million for Turkey, Syria earthquake relief. And the other point that I wanted to make, of course, that the various handlers of the White Helmets have been trying desperately to renew their image with their connection to Ukraine. You know, there has been a huge amount of propaganda linking the White Helmets to the paramedic efforts in Ukraine. and trying to basically put them back in the limelight, and it's been failing. And what we've seen in the media is an actual obfuscation of the White Helmet brand. We've seen them stating the Syria Civil Defense, or simply saying witnesses or sources in Idlib have been describing various events there. But now what we see is a flood of White Helmet references in colonial media. So 85 million is going into Idlib, only to Idlib, this little corner of northwest Syria that is controlled by the US and UK assets, including, as I keep saying, Al-Qaeda under various rebrands, currently Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So 85 million for Turkey and US partner organizations in Syria. So that makes it even clearer. And then let's have a look here at some of the propaganda that is now starting to come out as a result of this White Helmet rebranding, or this White Helmet renewal process. So here you have a headline one day ago in The Independent, which has been basically copy-pasted by the majority of the pro-NATO media. Heinous bombing of areas hit by earthquake by Assad's forces. Alicia Kearns, who is the Foreign Office Committee Chairman, Mike, sorry, I've slightly forgotten. Statement came after rescue teams from the White Helmets issued a letter to leaders urging them to pressure Damascus to ensure there is no bombing in the affected areas. So, of course, armed groups are not taking advantage of the humanitarian tragedy and launching drones, which is what I discovered when I spoke to military contacts in this area. I was told that the armed groups had launched various drones, and that the Syrian Arab Army Air Defense had launched a defense against those and brought the drones down. That was actually what this event was all about. Of course, that is not investigated, and it's not even mentioned by mainstream media, including the BBC, that also ran with this story. So Foreign Secretary James Cleverly also criticized the Assad regime. So we're back into that kind of lexicon, for the completely unacceptable bombing of Morea in the wake of the natural disaster. Morea, by the way, is under the control of Al-Qaeda and has been for some time. Then, as I mentioned, who's to say that the armed groups are not taking advantage of a humanitarian disaster to launch attacks and to move forward? On the basis, of course, that there had been a lot of talk of liberation of the area around the M4 that had been controlled by Russia and Turkey for some time. And here we see ISIS militants take advantage of massive earthquake to mount prison break. Now, the Raju prison near Afrin in northern Syria is actually under control of the Turkish intelligence. Also interesting that Turkey has recently been talking about a rapprochement with President Assad, and northern Syria now threatened by floods following deadly earthquake. Let's have a look at the content. Both these articles, by the way, are from The Cradle, so people can go and check them out, and the links will be in the show notes. So just taking from this article very quickly, countless winter crops in the Hasaka countryside, so that's the northeast, were flooded and potentially destroyed, threatening food security in Syria, which is already at risk due mainly to US occupation of the northeast and of wheat and barley resources and oil resources. And it's worth also mentioning here that most Syrians have said, well, we don't care about the sanctions, we don't need Western humanitarian response. We actually just want them to get out of Syria so that we have access to our resources. So the flooding of these tributaries, which is going on now, comes in the midst of a crisis across northern Syria, which has been caused by, according to many experts, by Ankara's monopolization and weaponization of water accessibility, given that most of these river branches originate in Turkish territory. Since 2019, Turkey has been cutting off water supply to 2 million civilians in northeast Syria. There is speculation that the Turkish dams and artificial lakes built by Ankara on the Euphrates River may have caused the earthquake. Ibrahim Saeed, a geography professor at Damascus University, said following the quake that the huge amount of water in the Ataturk Dam caused the earthquake, which collected 48 billion cubic meters of Euphrates water. This dam, he says, is a violation of nature and of the water rights of Iraq and Syria. There is a history of Turkey orchestrating famine both in Iraq and in Syria through the restriction of water supply. Deputy Director of Iraq's Seismological Center, Hasnain Jassim, Turkey has built 2,000 dams, reservoirs, and artificial lakes, some of which are near the epicenter of the earthquake. This is one of the reasons for the activation of the earth. Of course, it is also interesting. I mean, there are going to be many conspiracy theories concerning the cause of the earthquake.
Further relating to the subject at hand, Iran questions credibility of chemical watchdog Syria report. Iran's UN mission questions the credibility of a report issued by the World Chemical Watchdog that accuses Syria of an alleged 2018 chemical attack against the Arab country's own people. The report was issued by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, so-called Investigation and Identification Team, last month. It alleged that there were reasonable grounds to believe that at least one Syrian Air Force helicopter had dropped 2 cylinders of toxic gas on the town of Duma near the Syrian capital during the so-called incident. Damascus has strongly denounced and rejected the allegations as completely lacking in all scientific and objective evidentiary basis.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
Amir Saeed Eravani, Iran's permanent ambassador to the UN, echoed Syria's condemnation, addressing a United Nations Security Council gathering on Tuesday. The report, similar to the previous ones that had been issued by the OPCW about the alleged incident, is based on unauthorized sources, lacks the necessary legal conclusion, and has been prepared irrespective of the Syrian government observations, the envoy added. Iravani said the same Western countries that either supported or stayed silent towards the former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein's systematic deployment of chemical weapons against Iran during Saddam's 1980 to 1988 war against the Islamic Republic, had manipulated the OPCW and its subsidiary mechanisms into compiling the report against Syria so they can advance their political goals concerning the country. He said the Western states were staging a premeditated scenario against Syria. The Islamic Republic is deeply concerned about exploitation and politicization of the OPCW, Iravani noted, saying manipulation of the organization in such a way worked to dent its credibility. Group details, OPCW cover-up in Duma chemical attack. The alleged chemical attack reportedly hit the Syrian town April 7, 2018. We've gone over that. And the so-called incident on the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. A week later, the United States, Britain, and France launched a coordinated missile attack against sites and research facilities near Damascus and the western Syrian city of Homs, with the purported goal of paralyzing the Syrian government's capability to produce chemicals. Syria surrendered its stockpile of chemical weapons in 2014 to a joint mission led by the United States and OPCW, which oversaw the destruction of the weaponry. Damascus has repeatedly asserted that no chemical attack had happened on the town at the time, and the incident had been staged by foreign intelligence agencies to pressure the Syrian government at a time when it was making significant advances against foreign-backed territories across the Arab country's soil. The Syrian government also says it believes that the incident was staged by the White Helmets, a Western and Israeli-backed group, which claims to be a humanitarian NGO, but has long been accused of working with anti-Damascus terrorists and staging false flag gas attacks. And this is from mintpressnews.com. As mainstream journalists acknowledge Duma attacks were staged, the humanitarian Syria regime change networks tries to save a sinking ship. Over the past few, and this is from 2019 if I'm not mistaken, over the past few days, notable journalists and other figures in mainstream media have acknowledged that the alleged chemical weapons attack that occurred last April in Damascus suburb of Duma, so 2018, Syria, was likely staged by activist groups such as the Helmets. Their comments and investigations have largely vindicated the many journalists and academics who cast aspersions on the precipitous Western media campaign to blame that alleged attack on the Syrian government. Many of the dissenting voices were derided as conspiracy theorists or ignored entirely by mainstream sources, yet now that these revelations are being voiced by acceptable figures in mainstream media, those who have built their careers on promoting the white helmets and regime change in Syria are working to discredit these new dissenting voices. Among those on the counterattack are individuals connected to the oligarch-funded humanitarian regime change network that was the subject of a recent Mint Press expose. The alleged Duma attack, notably used as a justification for a military attack launched against Syria by the US and the UK and France, returned to the news cycle earlier this month following a report from James Harkin, a journalist who has written for The Guardian, Harper's, and the Financial Times. It's currently the director of the Center for Investigative Journalism. Harkin's report, which was published in The Intercept, cast doubt on the prevailing mainstream narrative surrounding the events that occurred in Duma last April. Harkin, in visiting Duma and the surrounding area, confirmed past reports by other independent journalists that no sarin gas had been used, which was also confirmed by the OPCW interim report, and claimed that the scenes filmed at the medical point in Duma, which were widely circulated by the mainstream media as evidence that a chemical weapon attack had occurred, had likely been staged. Harkin lamented the staging of the hospital scenes as a casualty of Syria's propaganda war. Elements of Harkin's rather rambling report were rapidly corroborated by BBC producer Riyam Daladi, who revealed on Twitter that he had proof after a 6-month investigation that those same hospital scenes had been staged. Daladi had previously been the cause of some consternation among the pro-regime change pundits when he had tweeted immediately after the alleged Duma chemical attack that he was sick and tired of activists and so-called rebels using the corpses of dead children to stage emotive scenes for Western consumption. Daladi was referring to the image of 2 children wrapped in a last hug that went viral on social media, eliciting sympathy for the chemical attack narrative. Daladi pointed out that the 2 children had been photographed on separate floors in the building before being artfully arranged into the last hug, positioned by the producers of the scene, which was picked up by the majority of corporate media and used to give the impression that the Syrian Arab army had used chemical weapons against their own civilians as they were concluding final amnesty negotiations with Jaish al-Islam, the extremist group then occupying Duma. Shortly after deleting the aforementioned tweet, Daladi protected his Twitter account by reiterating his observations in a less inflammatory tweet, while explaining that his first tweet had been correctly deemed in breach of BBC editorial policy through use of sick and tired and by not providing context. Daladi had notably been a member of the production team of the notorious September 2013 BBC Panorama documentary Saving Syria's Children, a report that was forensically investigated by independent researcher Robert Stewart, who concluded that the sequences filmed by BBC personnel and others at Atareb Hospital, Aleppo on 26/18/2013, purporting to show the aftermath of an incendiary bomb attack on a nearby school, are largely, if not entirely, staged. So Daladi, no stranger to controversy, appears to have once more broken with the ranks of mainstream media by admitting that the White Helmet chemical attack scenes in Duma Medical Point were without a doubt staged. One might ask why it took Daladi 6 months of investigation to arrive at the same conclusion as acclaimed journalist Robert Fisk and other on-the-ground journalists did just days after the attack occurred. At the time, those journalists had been labeled by Daladi and others as conspiracy theorists. However, the recent statements made by Daladi and Harkin's recent reports have hardly created a consensus regarding the alleged chemical weapons attack in Duma with the mainstream media. Instead, much the opposite has happened with the journalists and experts who have linked their professional reports to the credibility of groups like the US, UK incubated and financed White Helmets now going on in the offensive in an effort to trivialize the recent revelations regarding the events of April 7, 2018. Following the renewed interest in the Duma incident as a result of Harkin's report and Daladi's subsequent tweets, Tobias Schneider, a research fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute accused people like Harkin and Dalati of squabbling over the intricacies of the alleged chemical attacks in Duma, later calling these independent investigations and statements madness. We must presume that Schneider's Twitter accusation would also be directed at genuinely independent journalists and academics who presented evidence to counter the dominant Duma narratives produced by the usual suspects in corporate media and groups like the White Helmets affiliated to Jaish al-Islam, the brutal armed group in control of Duma. Among those are journalists who actually visited Duma immediately after the attack: Vanessa Beeley, Eva Bartlett, Robert Fisk of The Independent, Uli Gach from ZDF, Germany, and Pearson Sharp of OAN, One American News Network. Also potentially in Schneider's crosshairs are the members of the Working Group on Syria, Propaganda Media, WGSPM, established by Professor Piers Robinson, who produced an extensive briefing scrutinizing the media anomalies in the Duma attack. Unwilling to stop there, Schneider also announced that the GPPI would be publishing the first analytical study on the logical underpinning the Syrian regime's systematic use of improvised chlorine bombs in particular that would use the broadcast data set compilable and break down tactical operational strategic patterns in order to claim, despite a lack of evidence for chemical weapons use in Duma last year, or other separate incidents form a pattern that would incriminate the Syrian government in the events alleged to have taken place last April.
The whole notion of logic.
The report's now been published and it's been picked up by the usual purveyors and promoters of the chemical attack, narratives that are designed to criminalize the Syrian government. A look into Schneider's background in the organization that employs him hardly paints a picture of an objective observer of the evidence surrounding this hot-button issue. Quite the contrary. Schneider and the GPPI are directly connected to the humanitarian regime change network that was exposed in a recent MemPress series for its efforts to exploit the death of the late MP Joe Cox in order to manufacture consent for regime change in Syria and whitewash both the UK government connections to the White Helmets and the White Helmets' own troubling track record in facilitating and even directly committing war crimes. And here's a briefing regarding the White Helmets UN briefing.
Report that was just released. Yes, there will be. So are we ready? Good afternoon, colleagues. Sorry for the delay. Let me open the joint press conference of the Syrian Arab Republic and the Russian Federation. We have Russian Ambassador Nebenzia and Ambassador Bassam Sabah here. And we are starting with the remarks of Russian Ambassador. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Fyodor. Once again, I apologize for being too late and keeping you too long. I spoke too much today already, so I will not be repeating myself. You know the reason why we called this press conference. This report that was just released, which we, as I said, do not recognize, like we are not recognizing the IAT itself, do not support this structure. Its members are not even chemists. Look at the irony of this. They are just legal prosecutors appointed to rubber stamp fake reports. From its very establishment, the main purpose of the IAT has apparently been to whitewash the illegal acts of aggression against Syria in April 2017 and 2018. Instead of conducting genuine investigations, this team of so-called experts merely reduced itself to retranslating ungrounded accusations of some states. As for the methodology, the investigations of the OPCW Technical Secretariat are often based on the information from open sources, without even getting to the site of events that they analyze. Their conclusions cannot stand any criticism and abound in false assertions which are put forward without any respect to the main principle OPCW investigations, the chain of custody, which is not observed, has not been observed in all the recent investigations that were conducted. I will not be repeating myself too much because I already spoke in detail during the Council's meeting. I think that what I'll do, I'll give the floor to my colleague, Ambassador Bassam Sabak, to add a few words, and then I understand you will show a short video.
Thank you very much, Vasily. Thank you all for attending this press conference. It's very clear that Ambassador Nebenzia elaborates on the aspects related to the issues of the what's so-called the IIT report. In my statements before the Council, I also emphasize on many aspects, but let me here highlight two of them. First, the issue of illegitimacy. This team established in a very illegitimate way. Half of the members of the OPCW, 82 out of 193, voted for this. Many countries voted against or abstained or absent from voting. So
these are facts, they're numbers. You can quantify this. These are facts. These are facts. These are facts. They're numbers. You can quantify this.
Happened in the OPCW for the first time. Second, the methodology of work. The IIT basically follows the same wrong methodology of work which was used by the fact-finding mission. And mainly, Ambassador Nebenzia mentioned the issue of gathering or taking the samples and maintaining the chain of custody. According to the CWC, this has to be done by the inspectors and has to be maintained from the time where they collected until it's reached the laboratories, designated laboratories by the OPCWs. This did not happen in the case of Duma. They received
what I'm hearing is there are recurring instances of like a lack of scientific integrity here. So the investigations themselves, it's not to say that these scientific standards weren't upheld, but the reports themselves don't include that, which is a very important point.
These samples. From whom? We don't know. Who collected? We don't know. And from where? We don't know. So this is something very, very important. I wanted to show you some of the testimonies in a documentary we prepared from the people of Duma. Have this number in the reports, but no one have anything about them. So please.
Thank you, Theodore. Alan Bulkati from Russian news agency RIA Novosti. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you for doing this briefing. I have two questions, please. The first one is for both of you, ambassadors. What particular consequences will this last IIT report entail for Syria? And the second question is for Ambassador Sabak, please. Given the fact that you do not consider the IIT as a legal body, how do you foresee the further cooperation with OPCW, and is there a possibility that of the withdrawal of Syria from the OPCW?
Okay. In terms of our cooperation with the OPCW, we are a very responsible member of the OPCW. We took a strategic decision to join the OPCW in 2013. We implement our obligations according to the CWC, and we are working with the technical secretariats on all aspects related to our obligations. Anything out of obligations, we are not responsible for.
On what happens next, Alan, answering your question, I don't know what will happen next. Some of our partners in the Security Council are very inventive, I know it, and what they have in mind, that's not for me to judge. They didn't share it with me. Let's see. Let's see what happens next. But again, whatever happens next will be based on a hoax report. You have to understand that.
Pamela, you go next.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you, Ambassador Nebenzia. Thank you, Ambassador Savag. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. My question is about your stakeout yesterday, about the crossings from Turkey to Syria with the earthquake relief. We just heard from Dujarric that the hub is still going at Bab al-Hawa, but the road is damaged. It's preventing a lot of the aid from going in. Are you considering other crossings, which many countries have called for? Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. I think I answered very clearly yesterday. I said crossline is available. Syrian government is ready to help.
Are you opening up some of this to get but
our
move 1 kilometers from where raised the issue of 2 cylinders being moved away 60 kilometers from where they are supposed to be remain. 16. Once he said 16, then another time he said 60. So why were they removed? Do you have an explanation for why they were removed?
It's very, let's say, technical aspects. When these cylinders took from the site in Douma, they kept in a storage. And then we had the request from the OPCW that they wanted to revisit and to examine these 2 cylinders. So they asked us not to do anything with it unless they finish this job. Then the team from the OPCW came and examined the cylinder. So by this, we believe that this is not requested to be maintained in the same place anymore. Then we move it to another storage, and this storage hit by Israelis attacked, and the 2 cylinders were destroyed. So the argument by the OPCW that these 2 cylinders moved to the new storage has no validity, because for the reason they asked to keep it, we implemented. They re-examined and they visited the site where it was storage.
A quick follow-up. The report speaks about 43 people, and the names are. So 16 moved away 60 kilometers from where they are supposed to be remain. 16. So once he said 16, then another time he said 60. So why were they removed? Do you have an explanation for why they were removed?
It's very, let's say, technical aspects.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
When these cylinders took from the site in Douma, they kept in a storage. And then we had the request from the OPCW that they wanted to revisit and to examine these 2 cylinders. So they asked us not to do anything with it unless they finish this job. Then the team from the OPCW came and examined the cylinder. So by this, we believe that this is not requested to be maintained in the same place anymore. Then we move it to another storage, and this storage hit by Israelis attacked, and the 2 cylinders were destroyed. So the argument by the OPCW that these 2 cylinders moved to the new storage has no validity, because for the reason they asked to keep it, we implemented, they re-examined, and they visited the site where it was storage.
A quick follow-up, Mr. Also, the report speaks about 43 people, and the names are mentioned in the report. You said that there were no casualties or no mortalities in the incident. How come? Where did they come with the 43 names in this report, and where are the bodies?
The lady in the documentary said, my relatives, my uncle's family. She said, living in this. So after the incident, they disappeared. She said it. So if her relatives are up until now disappeared, so what we will consider this? I don't know.
Thank you so much. This is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic Daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. I have 2 questions, one for Ambassador Nebenzia and one for the Ambassador of Syria, Sabbagh. Mr. Nebenzia, 2 days ago, I think a senior Russian official, on the occasion of the speech given by Colin Powell in the Security Council on 6 February 2002, as you know, this senior official called for the follow-up investigation of the campaign of deceit that led to the invasion of Iraq. How do you gonna go ahead with this call? Are you serious about investigating the crimes and atrocities committed against the Iraqi people by the U.S. invasion? And my question to my Syrian ambassador, there is a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, put the 2 enemies, Palestinian and Israeli, were put in a cave or in a well, and they found a snake, and they have to cooperate together to save themselves. Would this incident, would this earthquake bring Syria and Turkey closer to each other, work together, and maybe reconcile in the near future? Thank you very much.
There are many things in this world left uninvestigated. And of course, the Iraqi hoax was never properly investigated. Nobody paid real responsibility for the crimes committed in Iraq. And I shall not be explaining to you why. Today, to think that there will be something like a tribunal on the Iraqi war, would be a little bit unrealistic. People are busy with other things these days, but the questions remain. I mean, there are so many crimes committed which are pretended to be not existent, non-existing then at all, as if nothing had happened. This is the hypocrisy of today's world, of the world itself, and of the policies of some of our partners, including here in the Security Council.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
Then Michel.
Hi, ambassadors.
The earthquake hit both of our people, Syrians and Turks. This is a very devastating humanitarian situation. And I think both people are now struggling for surviving. As for your questions, I think we made it very clear that whatever it says toward the improvement of the relations between our two countries has to be accompanied by actions on the ground. So there were some military meetings, and there were some exchange of views, and we are waiting to see tangible results on the ground. I think if we have a progress on that, you can see progress on the improvement of the relationship. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, ambassadors. This is Dezhi Xu with China Central Television. My questions are for Ambassador Sabah. I just talked to my friends in Syria. He said in Aleppo it's disaster here. Too many people on the rubble, no enough fuel for heavy vehicles and efficient workers there. And I noticed that just a couple moments ago, the Foreign Ministry of Syria actually said that U.S. sanctions hinder humanitarian relief efforts in Syria. So I just want to ask your opinion on this. How would the sanction hinder the efforts there? And second, I just want to know, because you just said that you are ready to help the rebel-controlled area for the humanitarian relief. If this is the case, that the government-controlled area, you don't have enough equipment or resources, how can you ensure that you will give enough resources for the rebel-controlled area, especially for more cross-line humanitarian operations? Thank you.
Despite the fact that this press conference is designated for the issue of the report of the IIT, but I will answer your question. How these sanctions hinder
they're concerned that the government in Syria is working actively to rebuild its chemical weapons stockpile and has been doing so since 2018. I'd like to get your response to that. On cross-border aid deliveries, can you just clarify for us that is it still the Syrian government's position that any cross-border aid deliveries is a violation of your sovereignty and territorial integrity? Is that still the case after the earthquake? The UN has spoken a lot about bureaucratic and security obstacles to cross-line deliveries. So what is the government doing to facilitate deliveries, cross-line deliveries now in the wake of the earthquake? And Ambassador, while we have you, will we see peace in Ukraine in 2023?
You asked me when there will be peace in Ukraine.
Will we see peace in Ukraine in 2023?
I hope, we all hope for peace. We all hope for them heeding to our concerns, which then see up
propaganda made against Syria. So I don't think they have anything substantiate these accusations. It's part of their lies, as they used to be. For the second question, it's not his country.
Government control. How are you going to help get supplies there when you don't? Is that
questions, please? The OPCW, you will have seen, previously reported on chemical weapons being used by rebel forces in Syria. Do you think that those reports by the OPCW are also a hoax?
We have plenties of informations given to the OPCW, given to the United Nations Security Council and 1540 Committee. All these informations basically ignored, never dealt with. At least, I mean, to my memory, more than 100 times we sent informations to the OPCW and to the UN regarding attempts by terrorist armed group to either use or to fabricate the use of chemical weapons. So that's one point. The second point, Syria requests investigations on 5 incidents where the terrorist armed group used chemical weapons against the Syrian Arab Republic people and army. From 2016 or 17 up until now, so 5 years, we have no result. This investigation is not achieved. This report is not concluded. So these indications give you a proof that the methodology of work in the OPCW is not working in the right directions. Why the investigations on incidents happened after 2017, Duma 2018, took place and report release, and incidents happened in 2017, reports are not released and investigations not finished. I mean, this is the questions. I mean, I don't have to judge anything. The situation is judging. The facts is judging. So let them prove to us that they work according to the correct methodologies. Today, Director General used terminology which I hear it for the first time. Highest criteria, best practices. We do not have such terminology in the CWC. The convention and its verification annexed clearly designated the steps on how you conduct investigations. And the technical secretariat has only one choice: to implement these provisions of the conventions. That's it.
And this is Bassem al-Sabag, Syrian diplomat. He's the permanent representative to the UN since November 22nd, 2022.
You say you cannot answer why they chose the Duma report. I think I can answer. Not easy, not a difficult guess, because they prepared it long. They wanted it to be something with which they could whitewash their aggression in April 2018. It was difficult, but they made it. Congratulations. But I mean, you see by yourself that it's so stitched with such bad threats that you can see it with your eyes, with your open. It's seen in every finding of that report.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
So the answer is clear. Why they are not rushing to conduct investigations on reports on incidents that you were dutifully reporting them. I remember it very well. And that's all being piled in the Secretariat without any answer, without any initiative to begin investigation. Look, today I think I was lucky because I was accompanied by an eloquent host who answered most of the questions, and I think that you should be talking to Ambassador Sabak more often, and he will tell you more interesting things.
Yes, no, very well. And more news coming out of Syria. There is a Gofundme that is refusing, or Gofundme, the company, is refusing to fund Syria relief effort funding, and they are funding White Helmets. So GoFundMe is refusing to send aid to Syria over sanctions from the U.S. Treasury despite the devastating earthquake that struck the country earlier in the week. GoFundMe, a proclaiming lead platform for fundraising, has been found to be complicit in the U.S. waged war in Syria, complying with U.S. sanctions prohibiting aid from making it to the disaster-stricken country. Several social media users went on Twitter to report on the issue after the fundraising firm suspended the fundraisers for Syria after the earthquake struck the country, with many highlighting the severe repercussions that the sanctions on Syria have been carrying for the Syrian health sector and rescue efforts. An activist, Kevork Almasian, the founder of Syriana Analysis, reported that the company temporarily suspended our crowdfunding for the people affected by the earthquake in Syria. They claimed that they wanted to ensure that the aid was going to a humanitarian organization and that it was making it to its hands. Another user posted a screenshot of an email they received from GoFundMe saying, "Thank you for the efforts to help those affected by the earthquakes in Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon."
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Just rationally speaking, maybe we mentioned Turkey because there are more people there, but the problems with the earthquake, the effect of the earthquake, was felt in Syria possibly worse than in Turkey. So to even order it in that way, Turkey, Syria, is indicative of how they think about the situation. So GoFundMe is closely monitoring events in the region, and we're committed to helping people help those in need. The twist came in the following paragraph, in which the email read, "As a U.S. company, we are required to follow our terms and services, or our terms of service, payment industry requirements, and applicable laws, including those set by the U.S. Treasury Department, which prohibit GoFundMe from allowing fundraisers meeting this criteria to raise money on our platform. For this reason, we're writing to let you know that your GoFundMe account's been closed due to sanctions involving an unsupported country and a violation of the prohibited conduct section of our terms of service. This email, or the email concluded." "I'm absolutely disgusted and enraged by this," the user commented. Another user reported in German that they set up a GoFundMe and managed to collect some $10,000, or £10,000, but their bid to raise funds for Syria fell flat after the firm sent them an email informing them that the fundraiser was suspended because you appear to be raising funds for a cause in a location currently subject to economic sanctions by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or other relevant government agencies. We are not even allowed to donate to those in need. Unbelievable. I'm angry and speechless. Many other prominent activists such as Max Blumenthal and Hadi Nasrallah highlighted the fact that the West was not allowing Syria to receive funds after having funded terrorist organizations in the country. Thanks to criminal Western sanctions, international cargo planes cannot land at Syrian airports, and Syrians cannot use GoFundMe or credit cards. Meanwhile, the U.S. military occupies 1/3 of the country, stealing Syria's oil, a key source of revenue it uses to buy food and aid, Blumenthal said on Twitter. GoFundMe is suspending fundraisers for Syrians in the regions under the Sanctions Act, Aleppo included. Thousands of dollars have been frozen because someone somewhere in the U.S. said Syrians must be punished, Nasrallah pointed out. All the while, as GoFundMe was prohibiting aid from making it into Syria, the fundraising organization was flaunting that more than $100,000 were raised to support the White Helmets, an NGO organization operating in Syria that's been accused of colluding with the West and terrorist organizations to commit and stage human rights violations in the country. This comes after the United Nations stressed on Thursday the need to avoid politicization of aid to earthquake victims in Syria and urged Washington and Brussels to ensure there were no impediments. Western countries are not providing necessary aid to the Syrian government, which is dealing with the fallout of the devastating earthquake, and only send them to areas in Syria that are controlled by militant terrorist groups, the Syrian President's special advisor Boutaina Shahban said on Thursday. Unfortunately, the West only cares about areas where the terrorists are, where the White Helmets are, but they don't care about the areas in which most Syrian people live. Most of the money and all the equipment has been dispatched to Turkey from Europe and from the U.S., nothing to Syria from Europe at all, Shahban told British broadcaster Sky News. This is happening as thousands, including children, are still calling for help from under the rubble in Syria. However, the rolling crisis through which most Syrians are living didn't gain international support, mainly due to the U.S. draconian sanctions. Moreover, officials say it'll be years before the streetscapes of the stricken areas bear any resemblance to their old selves. As such, rebuilding is going to take a very long time. Some buildings may look okay from the outside. However, certain structural components might have been damaged to the extent that some of these buildings will have to be torn down, a process that alone could take years. And this is an example of GoFundMe that is White Helmet has an impetus on helping the White Helmets, and it's being allowed. All right, you're going to watch this space. We will return with more world news. The First Minister of Scotland resigns. Here's her speech.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming along. I'm sorry to break into your half-term break. Being First Minister of Scotland is, in my admittedly biased opinion, the very best job in the world. It is a privilege beyond measure, one that has sustained and inspired me in good times and through the toughest hours of my toughest days. I am proud to stand here as the first female and longest serving incumbent of this office. And I'm very proud of what has been achieved in the years I've been in Bute House. However, since my very first moments in the job, I have believed that part of serving well would be to know, almost instinctively, when the time is right to make way for someone else. And when that time came, to have the courage to do so, even if to many across the country and in my party, it might feel too soon. In my head and in my heart, I know that time is now, that it is right for me, for my party, and for the country. And so today I am announcing my intention to step down as First Minister and leader of my party. I have asked the National Secretary of the SNP to begin the process of electing a new party leader, and I will remain in office until my successor is elected. I know there will be some across the country who feel upset by this decision and by the fact I am taking it now. Of course, for balance, there will be others who will, how should I put this, cope with the news just fine. Such is the beauty of democracy. But to those who do feel shocked, disappointed, perhaps even a bit angry with me, please know that while hard, and be in no doubt, this is really hard for me, my decision comes from a place of duty and of love. Tough love, perhaps, but love nevertheless for my party and above all for the country. Let me set out as best as I can my reasons. First, though I know it will be tempting to see it as such, this decision is not a reaction to short-term pressures. Of course, there are difficult issues confronting the government just now, but when is that ever not the case? I have spent almost 3 decades in frontline politics, a decade and a half on the top or second top rung of government. When it comes to navigating choppy waters, resolving seemingly intractable issues, or soldiering on when walking away would be the simpler option, I have plenty of experience to draw on. So if this was just a question of my ability or my resilience to get through the latest period of pressure, I wouldn't be standing here today, but it's not. This decision comes from a deeper and longer term assessment. I know it might seem sudden, but I have been wrestling with it, albeit with oscillating levels of intensity for some weeks. Essentially, I've been trying to answer 2 questions. Is carrying on right for me? And more importantly, is me carrying on right for the country, for my party, and for the independence cause I have devoted my life to? I understand why some will automatically answer yes to that second question. But in truth, I have been having to work harder in recent times to convince myself that the answer to either of them, when examined deeply, is yes. And I've reached the difficult conclusion that it's not. The questions are inextricably linked, but let me First Minister for over 8 years, and I was Deputy First Minister for the best part of 8 years before that. These jobs are a privilege, but they are also rightly hard, and especially in the case of First Minister, relentlessly so. Now, to be clear, I'm not expecting violins here, but I am a human being as well as a politician. When I entered government in 2007, My niece and youngest nephew were babies, just months old. As I stepped down, they are about to celebrate their 17th birthdays. Now that I think about it, that's exactly the age to be horrified at the thought of your auntie suddenly having more time for you. My point is this: giving absolutely everything of yourself to this job is the only way to do it. The country deserves nothing less. But in truth, that can only be done by anyone for so long. For me, it is now in danger of becoming too long. A First Minister is never off duty. Particularly in this day and age, there is virtually no privacy. Even ordinary stuff that most people take for granted, like going for a coffee with friends or for a walk on your own, becomes very difficult. And the nature and form of modern political discourse means that there is a much greater intensity, dare I say it, brutality to life as a politician than in years gone by. All in all, and actually for a long time without it being apparent, it takes its toll on you and on those around you. And if that is true in the best of times, it has been more so in recent years. Leading this country through the COVID pandemic is by far the toughest thing I've done. It may well be the toughest thing I ever do. I certainly hope so. Now, by no stretch of the imagination was my job the hardest in the country during that time. But the weight of responsibility was immense. And it's only very recently, I think, that I've started to comprehend, let alone process, the physical and mental impact of it on me. So what I'm really saying is this: if the only question was, can I battle on for another few months, then the answer is yes, of course I can. But if the question is, can I give this job everything it demands and deserves for another year, let alone for the remainder of this parliamentary term, give it every ounce of energy that it needs in the way that I have strived to do every day for the past 8 years, the answer honestly is different. And as that is my conclusion, hard though it has been for me to reach it, then given the nature and scale of the challenges the country faces, I have a duty to say so now. I feel that duty first and foremost to our country to ensure that it has the energy of leadership that it needs, not just today, but through the years that remain of this parliamentary term. And right now, in a very particular sense, I feel that duty to my party too. We are at a critical moment. The blocking of a referendum as the accepted constitutional route to independence is a democratic outrage. But it puts the onus on us to decide how Scottish democracy will be protected and to ensure that the will of the Scottish people prevails. My preference of using the next Westminster election as a de facto referendum is well known. I've never pretended it is perfect, no second best option ever is, nor that there are no alternatives. That is why I've always been clear that the decision must be taken by the SNP collectively, not by me alone. But I know my party well enough to understand that my view as leader would carry enormous, probably decisive weight when our conference meets next month. And I cannot, in good conscience, ask the party to choose an option based on my judgment, whilst not being convinced that I would be there as a leader to see it through. By making my decision clear now, I free the SNP to choose the path it believes to be the right one, without worrying about the perceived implications for my leadership, and in the knowledge that a new leader will steer us, I believe, successfully on that path. Now, there are two further reflections that have weighed in my decision. These, I suppose, are more about our political culture and the nature and impact of the dominance and longevity that come from success in politics. And the first, I hope my party will take heart from. One of the difficulties in coming to terms with this decision is that I am confident that I can and would lead the SNP to further electoral success. We remain by far the most trusted party in Scotland. And while for every person in Scotland who loves me, there is another who, let's say, might not be quite so enthusiastic, we are firmly on course to win the next election, while our opponents remain adrift. But the longer any leader is in office, the more opinions about them become fixed and very hard to change. And that matters. Individual polls come and go, but I am firmly of the view that there is now majority support for independence in Scotland. But that support needs to be solidified, and it needs to grow further if our independent Scotland is to have the best possible foundation. To achieve that, we must reach across the divide in Scottish politics. And my judgment now is that a new leader will be better able to do this. Someone about whom the mind of almost everyone in the country is not already made up, for better or worse. Someone who is not something in polarised opinions, fair or unfair, as I now am. The good news, as the country will now get to see more clearly perhaps, is that the SNP is full of talented individuals, more than up to that task. My second reflection is related. I feel more and more each day now that the fixed opinions people increasingly have about me, as I say, some fair, others little more than caricature, are being used as barriers to reasoned debate in our country. Statements and decisions that should not be controversial at all quickly become so. Issues that are controversial end up almost irrationally so. Too often I see issues presented and as a result viewed not on their own merits but through the prism of what I think and what people think about me. I've always been of the belief that no one individual should be dominant in any system for too long. But while it's easy to hold that view in the abstract, it is much harder to live by it. With this decision, I am trying to do so. Indeed, if all parties were to take this opportunity to depolarise public debate just a bit, to focus more on issues than on personalities, and to reset the tone and the tenor of our discourse, then this decision, right for me and I believe for my party and the country, might also prove to be good for our politics. I certainly live in hope. Now, a couple of final points before I take a few questions. While I am stepping down from leadership, I am not leaving politics. There are many issues I care deeply about and hope to champion in future. One of these is the promise, the national mission so close to my heart to improve the life chances of care experienced young people and ensure they grow up nurtured and loved. My commitment to these young people will be lifelong. And obviously, there is independence. Winning independence is the cause I have dedicated a lifetime to. It is a cause I believe in with every fibre of my being. And it is a cause I am convinced is being won. I intend to be there as it is won every step of the way. Yesterday morning, I attended the funeral of a very, very dear friend and long-standing independence activist, a wonderful man by the name of Alan Angus. It was actually during that funeral service that I went from being 99% certain about this decision to 100% certain, though I know Alan would not be at all happy to have played any part in my departure, so I'm sorry, Alan. But his funeral reminded me that the cause of independence is so much bigger than any one individual, that all of us who believe in it contribute in different ways at different stages of our lives. Since I was 16, I have contributed as an activist, a campaigner, and a leader. And so now as we look to what I firmly believe is the final stage in Scotland's journey to independence, albeit a hard one, I hope to use all the experience and perspective I've gathered over these years to help get us there. Lastly, there will be time in the days to come for me and others to reflect on what has been achieved during my time as First Minister. I'm pretty certain there will be plenty of commentary on my mistakes as well. I will have more to say before I demit office, but allow me some brief reflections now. Scotland is a changed country since 2014, and in so many ways it is changed for the better. Young people from deprived backgrounds have never had a better chance of going to university than now. Our investment to double early learning and childcare as use of power and fun, create hush and
you now owe Douglas Ross, if anyone can, and what is the timetable now for your replacement? And on a slightly lighter note, do you now owe Douglas Ross £100?
No matter how many times you ask it of me over the next few weeks, no matter how many inventive ways you find of asking it, I am not going to say who my preference will be to succeed me. What I do know is that the SNP is awash with talented individuals. One of the things that I've often reflected on is that when a political party, any political party in any country has very dominant individuals, others, through no fault of the dominant individual, I should say, and not sometimes for the want of trying, often others become a bit eclipsed there. So what I am looking forward to, and I think the country will enjoy over these next few weeks, is seeing that talent and seeing the array of talent. I believe I have led this country closer to independence. I believe we are in the final phase of that journey. I think it will be hard because now we have the dual challenge, the one we always had of convincing a majority, a solid, sustainable majority of the merits of independence, but also secondly, a challenge that is new of finding, in the face of Westminster anti-democratic opposition, that democratic route to allowing the will of the Scottish people to be expressed. And I believe that my successor, I firmly believe that my successor, whoever he or she may be, will lead Scotland to independence, and I'll be there cheering him or her on every single step of the way. Conor Gillis from Sky.
Thanks, First Minister. You say that you've been wrestling with this decision for a number of weeks now, and it's not in reaction to some issues over the last couple of weeks, couple of months. Do you believe, though, that the issues, and particularly the row around transgender prisoners, was the straw that broke the camel's back here? And second of all, has it been a failure of your leadership not to have delivered independence, since that was your sort of founding mission back in 2014?
I'll leave other people to be the judge of my leadership. It's probably a bit invidious beyond saying what I'm proud of, and taking this country ever closer to independence is one of those things. It's a bit invidious for me to cast that judgment. No, that issue wasn't the final straw. Look, I'm long enough in the tooth. I've been in politics, as all of you know, for a long, long time. I'm not going to stand here and insult your intelligence and say that I live in a world that is divorced from the realities of what is going on around me. But it's not the case that this decision is because of short-term issues. I've faced more short-term issues from time to time over my years in politics than I care to remember. And if it was just that, I wouldn't be standing here today. What I would say, though, is this, and I did allude to this in my remarks. I suppose when I look at some of the issues that...
I'm not so sure of that. She doesn't really seem convinced of that. Doesn't seem like she believes that, to be honest.
That are being hotly debated in Scotland right now. One of the things that I do regret, I suppose, is not being able to bring a more rational approach to these debates. And I think that goes back to some of what I said earlier. These debates, some of them, one in particular,
the whole notion of logic
is obviously controversial in its own right. But I think layered on to the top of that, there has been people's views about me, about independence, and suddenly debates that should be rational and that we should be capable as a country of having rationally become something very different.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
I will always be a voice for inclusion, for equality, for human rights and dignity. I have been, am, and will always be a feminist. I will fight for women's rights, and I will stand up against threats to women's rights every day that I have breath in my body. But I'll also stand up for any stigmatised, discriminated against, marginalised and vulnerable group in society. And I believe, and call me, you know, an optimist. Not many people call me an optimist, but I am at heart an optimist. I believe these things can and must, in any progressive, liberal, inclusive society, find ways of coexisting. And whatever role I play in politics in the future, I will always seek to do everything I can to turn that into a reality. Colin Mackay.
How have you gone from having plenty in the tank 3 weeks ago to an empty tank today? What is it that's changed over the last few weeks? You've mentioned some things. The only thing you didn't mention is the police inquiry into the party's finances.
Look, these things are not the reason I'm standing here today. These are not factors, nor will my decision today affect these things, and all of these things will take their course. I said something in my remarks that I appreciate will divide opinion in Scotland. I'm a human being, and every human being every day wrestles with a whole load of conflicting emotions. And over the last number of weeks, probably since around the turn of the year, I've been struggling with just that. I get up in the morning and I tell myself, and usually I convince myself that I've got what it takes to keep going and keep going and keep going. But then I realise that's maybe not as true, and you go through a process of just deciding where it is in that decision you're going to fall, and that's the decision I've come to today. I could go on for another few months, I don't know, 6 months, a year maybe, but I know that as time passed, I would have less and less energy to give to the job, and I can't do the job on anything other than a 100% basis. The country deserves nothing less than that. So that's the judgment I've come to. If that's my feeling, that I'm going to get in a relatively short space of time to where I am today, then I owe it to the country to say it now, so that new leadership can be in place. And as I said, in relation to my party, I don't want to stand at a special conference, a month or so from now, and ask my party to take my judgment, opt for a path, knowing that I have doubts about my ability to see it through as leader. This is a better thing to do today for me, for my party, and I believe for the country too. James Cook.
First Minister, I think it's fair to say that the NHS is in a really serious situation. The attainment gap between rich and poor pupils, which you'd said was one of your core missions as First Minister, remains pretty wide. And despite what you're saying today, polls suggest that you've got nowhere near creating a sustained majority for independence. Do you have regrets about one or any of those issues?
Oh, again, James, I'm a human being. I don't know if you've got regrets about things in your life. Of course, I've got regrets about all sorts of things in my life. And as I reflect on my time as First Minister, there'll be things I am hugely proud of and things that I regret. And if I had my time again, I might do differently. And forgive me, there'll be plenty of time for me to do that. I'm sure be plenty of time for you to do that, and I'm sure you will. So, yeah, but I'm proud of my time as First Minister. But I'm also proud that I know when it's time to move on and to pass on to someone else. The country, the cause I believe in, my party, everything is bigger than any politician, no matter who they are and no matter how dominant they've been for no matter how much time. Politicians come and go all the time. The country is what matters, and the future of the country is what matters. I'm proud of the part I have played and hope to continue to play in a different capacity in building the future of this country. But I think in terms of leadership, it's time for someone else. I think the easier sometimes thing to do, and the thing that traditionally politicians tend to do, is just to cling on and on and on and on and on until everybody is sort of pushing for you to go. It's harder because there's always reasons not to. Yeah, if I stay a bit longer, I can do this. If I stay a bit longer, something might happen. It's always easier to find the reasons not to make a decision. I think it's better to make the decision when you know in your heart that it's the right one for you and for your country. I'm not sure I want to say this sentence actually. I will be 53 this year. I entered Parliament, when I was 29. I've been in government since I was 37. I have literally done this in one capacity or another for all of my life. I've been Nicola Sturgeon, the politician, for all of my life. It's been a privilege. I have done things, met people, gone places, had experiences I would never have done. I have a depth of gratitude to the party, that I lead, to the country that I serve, that I can never find the words to express. But having reached this stage in my life, maybe I want to spend a bit of time on Nicola Sturgeon the person, the human being, and contribute differently. And does that sound in some ways selfish? I hope it doesn't, because I have given and will, in whatever way I can, continue to give everything I can in service to this country. But I need for me, and I think it's right for the country, to do that in a different way in future, and that is what I'm seeking to do. And the more I talk, the more convinced I am that this is the right decision for me. I'll take Louise Scott from ITV. I'm going to end up doing what I said I wouldn't do. I'm not going to do that. Louise.
First Minister, we've heard rumblings of divisions within the party in recent weeks, particularly around certain issues. Ultimately, did you lose trust in your leadership from certain key members of your party?
I think you'd have to ask individuals to give their views on my leadership. I think any objective analysis would suggest that that's not true. You know, I enjoy, the risk of sounding immodest here, which, as you know, I never like to do. But I, even in times that would be described, have been described by most of you as tough, I enjoy approval ratings after 8 years in government that most leaders would give their right arm for. So, yes, of course, the longer any leader is in office, the more people will find things to disagree with you on, because nobody agrees with any other person 100%. And that concept of, that whole idea of longevity in politics, the longer you lead, the more, you will find issues that people find it hard to agree with you on. But, I believe I could, if it was just about, can I lead this country forward, certainly the party to electoral success, the answer is yes, but it is much deeper than that, which is what I've been trying to give a sense of today. Who will we have next? Kieran Jenkins.
First Minister, you said, judge me on my record, didn't you? You remember saying that in the context of the education attainment gap between the best and the worst off pupils. Now is surely the time to do that. Do you think you failed those young people?
No, I don't.
You made a promise, you didn't deliver it. The NHS is in a pretty perilous state. Drugs deaths have been catastrophic. When you look back, do you wish it were different, that you could have been more successful in those areas in which you've had complete or considerable control?
Well, I'll refer back to a question one of your colleagues asked me about, anybody taking stock of the things they're proud of, the things they wish they could turn the clock back and do differently, and I'll do that. And you use the terms judge me. One thing I can be absolutely certain of is people will judge me. There's been no shortage of judgments on me and what I've done or not done in office, and I'm pretty certain that will continue. But if you take young people, today, and I remember, possibly including by you, but certainly by plenty in this room, being challenged on this when I became First Minister, about the attainment gap in access to university. Today, we're on track to close that. If you're a young person from a deprived background or a background like the one I come from, you've got a better chance than you've ever had before of going to university. At the other end of the education system, that fundamental investment in expansion, doubling early years childcare and education is transformational. Effects won't be seen immediately, but the effects that will have as children go through the school system are considerable. The NHS everywhere, health services are under pressure. This country is the only one in the UK that has not faced industrial action in our health service because of our approach to working with those in the service together in partnership to tackle these challenges, and that will continue. So on a whole range of these things, I'll have plenty of time to reflect at greater length, and I'm pretty certain all of you will reflect at length. But one thing is for sure, there will be no shortage of judgment on me and my time as First Minister. Right, I'm going to take a couple more, and Alan Smith from Bauer is the next one.
Thank you, First Minister. You spoke about this has been something you've been thinking about a matter of weeks and not in response to short-term pressures, but at what point did you start to consider it? Was there a particular moment those weeks ago, and who did you have conversations with at that time about whether or not this is the right decision to take?
I've been thinking about it. I used the term in my remarks with oscillating intensity, and that's true. There are some days, I wouldn't have thought about it at all because, frankly, too much else. And then Other times it's weighed more heavily. I don't know, possibly a couple of weeks ago it just started to crystallise a bit more, but inevitably, again, here's the human thing, it always takes you a bit of time, I think, between the point where probably deep down inside you've made a decision and being able to actually admit that to yourself before you even start telling other people. So I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, except that sitting in the funeral service for Alan yesterday, surrounded by SNP members, mourning somebody that 89 years old had campaigned all his life for independence, it did have that clarifying effect that stepping down as leader doesn't mean I stop contributing to the cause of independence. It doesn't mean you stop making a contribution. Everybody has their time, and I think in leadership one of the hardest but one of the most important things to do is know when that time is up. In terms of who I talked about, obviously my close family, the small number of friends. One of the things in leadership you really do learn is who your true friends are in life. And so if you're one of the small number who, mainly because I wouldn't have been able to tell you without crying over the last 24 hours, I didn't phone but texted this morning just before the news broke, know you're one of those friends, and thank you for all your support. And Neil Pooran from PA.
Thanks, First Minister. First of all, can you just confirm if you'll be staying on as an MSP and what kind of issues you'll be campaigning on as an MSP? And also, will the cooperation agreement with the Scottish Green Party need to be renegotiated now if you as First Minister are no longer in that role?
The cooperation agreement stands. I'm not going to try to dictate anything, or at this stage, certainly not now and hopefully not ever, start to issue unsolicited advice to my successor. I know from experience that's not always something that is welcome. Don't report that bit. But I think the cooperation agreement with the Greens has been a thoroughly good thing for the government, for the country, and I would hope to see that continue. Your first question, which yes, I do intend to remain in Parliament. I hope to stay in Parliament till, or intend to stay in Parliament till certainly the next election, and like all MSPs, take a decision about beyond that, the time of the next election. The other body of people, I suppose, that I want to thank, and was hesitant in doing it today in case I started to cry, are my constituents who have supported me through thick and thin, put their trust in me time and again. My constituency party, what was Glasgow Govan, now Glasgow Southside, that have literally been by my side since 1995, and I look forward to continuing to serve my constituency to the best of my ability. I've given some indication of the kind of issues I'll want to be a voice on. There's some very important reform to the criminal justice system coming forward, I know, around improving access to justice for victims of sexual offences. They'll be controversial. Maybe they could be one of the first tests of a more depolarised political debate, but I will be the strongest, most strenuous advocate for these reforms. Young people, care-experienced young people, I certainly will continue to champion that cause. It's one that got under my skin and into my heart in a way that few other issues did over my time as First Minister. Beyond that, we will see. I'm looking forward to new opportunities, new challenges, and just a new way of living life. And perhaps, and above all else, that's what I'm most looking forward to, just a different way of living life, catching up with the people, the friends that I've not had much opportunity to spend time with. But watch this space, there's plenty more to come. Right, with that, I'm going to depart from
Watch
now.
this space. And here we have.
I'm not going to.
Let's go a little further with that. This is Sky News' coverage on
politics and in the independence movement. She's the life and soul of that movement, and that makes its future very uncertain.
Just a few close friends got the heads up, including ex-SNP Westminster leader Ian Blackford.
Do you worry, though, that this is a setback for those who believe in independence, because she was so central to everything to do with that movement?
I think what has happened today is that we've lost the best leader that we could have had, the best First Minister that Scotland has had. I regret that. I fully understand the reasons why Nicola has taken this decision. We need to make sure, I think all of us have a duty and a responsibility to build on her legacy. The phrase which is often used, that we stand on the shoulders of giants, there's no one that's more true for than for Nicola Sturgeon as the First Minister.
It's been some run since 2014. Taking over from Alex Salmond after defeating the independence referendum, later taking him on when he led a breakaway party. But Nicola Sturgeon kept on winning election after election in Scotland, through Brexit, through COVID, as prime ministers came and went. Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Rishi Sunak is her fifth, each one dismissing her calls for a second independence referendum. The Prime Minister thanked her today for her long-standing service. On policy, she brought in more free childcare and payments for the poorest families, and said her defining mission...
It matters so much to me that I've done something politicians don't often do. I've put my own neck on the line.
...was to close the gap between the best and worst off pupils in schools.
You said, judge me on my record, didn't you? You remember saying that. When you look back, do you wish it were different, that you could have been more successful in those areas?
And your tributes to Nicola Sturgeon?
Look, I think it's important to recognise that Nicola Sturgeon has been at the forefront of Scottish politics for some 20 years. She's led us through some of the most challenging periods in our country's history, the pandemic being a good example of that. And whilst I've got lots of disagreements with her, whilst I've had lots of arguments with her over the years, I'm sure I'll have arguments in the future, that level of service, I think, is worthy of respect, but also a thank you.
Do you see this as an opportunity?
Look, it's of course an opportunity to think about new ideas and a new vision for our country, but I think it is an important moment to recognise and respect the role that Nicola Sturgeon has played, but to also say that a different future is possible, change is possible, but that's perhaps for another day when I want to make the case for what I think a Labour government can achieve both for Scotland but for the wider UK.
I mean, Labour seems to be pushing the Conservatives into third place in this country. I mean, you're obviously benefiting from the Starmer effect in England.
Well, look, we've benefited a lot from the Keir Starmer effect. I think we benefited from the Boris Johnson effect. I think we benefited from the Liz Truss effect. I think we benefited from the fact that people think that many occasions both governments have felt a bit out of touch. But what I've said clearly to my own party, and I'll continue to say publicly, is the easy part in politics is to talk about why your opponents deserve to lose. The hard part in politics is to persuade people why you deserve to win, and that's the part that I'm more interested in as we lead into the next general election, is making the positive case about why we need a Labour government across the country.
And on the current controversy around gender recognition reform, which Nicola Sturgeon herself said had sort of become, that she'd become a sort of a polarising figure in that, you actually agree with her?
Look, I agree in the need to remove the inhumanities in the process of obtaining a GRC. I still think there's clarity required in terms of protection of single-sex spaces based on biological sex in the appropriate circumstances, much greater safeguarding required. But were we right to support removing those inhumanities? I absolutely stand by that.
Right. I mean, we had John Nicholson sort of dismiss the polls, and you seem to be being very cautious actually about your own position here. But the truth is, you know, Labour MPs in Scotland could be vital to any Labour government because it may not be a majority in England.
Well, I would go further than that. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with John's 20% divide, but we can argue about the numbers another time. I think it's more than vital. I think it's essential. I don't think you get a UK Labour government unless you get a significant number of seats in Scotland. I know Keir Starmer believes the same. I know he wants to be a Prime Minister for all parts of the United Kingdom. That means having significant seats in Scotland, but we're not complacent about that. We've got work to do, and we want to make sure Scotland helps lead the way to elect a UK Labour government.
Anna Sawa, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's bring in the Conservatives leader in Scotland, Douglas Ross. Well, if Anna Sawa has been rather gracious about Nicola Sturgeon, I mean, your tweets so far don't seem to be on the same lines. Can you hear me, Douglas Ross? I don't think Douglas Ross can hear me, so let me bring back in... well, let's talk about how this plays out then, in terms of a successor. You have established figures like Angus Robertson. Is that the kind of the answer to the SNP's problem?
Well, no one person is ever an answer to a political party. Political parties are made up of numerous individuals. As you know, there's a number, you don't want me to fall into the cliche of saying there's a number of talented people,
yes.
all of whom...
But is he the front runner?
Well, the bookies have Angus Robertson as the front runner today. It has to be a member of the Scottish Parliament. It has to be an MSP, so it cannot be an MP. It's a question of who the party chooses, and then of course Holyrood then has to choose as a parliament and decide who it wants as the First Minister. Incidentally, I don't dismiss the polls as you suggested. Every politician pays attention to polls and would be fibbing if they didn't. I just remark that the polls show Nicola Sturgeon clearly ahead.
But isn't the truth that you're going in as a party into this conference next month with a lot of you disagreeing with Nicola Sturgeon when it comes to treating the next election as a referendum, because as the polls are suggesting, a lot of voters don't like it?
In my adult lifetime, unionist politicians at Westminster have always accepted Scotland's right to leave the Union. This is the first time in my lifetime that they've not accepted that right, or not at least agreed how we can leave the Union. That undoubtedly poses challenges for those of us who believe in parliamentary democracy.
Right, but do you think I was going to do a U-turn on this question of treating it as a...
I don't know. I think we're going to have a discussion and work out where we go from here.
Let's bring in Douglas Ross, who I think can now hear us. Douglas Ross, are you there?
I am, yes, I can hear you.
Right, so, I mean, what would you like to say about Nicola Sturgeon's time? I mean, we heard Anna Sawa paying tribute to her. Would you do the same?
Well, I pay tribute to the fact that she's led Scotland for over 8 years. She's Scotland's first female First Minister. But I can't just forget about her record in government, which has been one of failure, focusing more on separating Scotland from the rest of the UK than tackling the drug death scandal, than building ferries for communities that see these as vital infrastructure links, for ensuring that our education remained world class. It's actually gone down the international ranking. So these things do fall at the First Minister's door, and over 8 years she's prioritised her party's commitment to separating Scotland than delivering for the whole of Scotland.
Why do you think she's so popular then and you're falling into third place?
Well, clearly, I think John Nicholson was just saying polls go up and down, and what we've seen recently is Nicola Sturgeon's own personal approval and the SNP's approval falling. They have rushed through the gender recognition reform bill, where Nicola Sturgeon got to the stage that 12 times when I asked her if a double rapist was a man or a woman, couldn't answer. She couldn't get herself out of that hole, and on that issue and many others, in this case supported by Labour and the Liberal Democrats, on GRR, they were on the wrong side of public opinion.
So you think she's gone because she was getting it wrong?
Well, yes, I do believe that. Clearly it's had a personal toll being in office for this long, not just as First Minister, but Deputy First Minister, and before that, Health Secretary. But there is no denying that on key policies and the key political issue that we've been debating in Scotland for the last few weeks, I think Nicola Sturgeon got it completely wrong, and those parties who supported her.
Let me just get John Nicholson to answer that.
Well, just enormously ungracious from Douglas Ross. The Tories haven't won an election in Scotland since the 1950s. He's sadly, I suppose from his perspective, one of the least popular politicians in Scotland. He would give his eye teeth for the kind of popularity ratings that Nicola Sturgeon has. Douglas Ross?
Well, at least I'm on these rankings. John Nicholson is not, but that would be getting petty if I was to get into that argument. Look, I'm a political opponent to Nicola Sturgeon. Personally, we've never really got on with each other, but I do recognise her commitment to the job, her commitment to being First Minister of Scotland, but it would be wrong of me to try and hide what I think are major failings that she has overseen in her time as First Minister of Scotland, and before that as Health Secretary and Deputy First Minister. For a decade and a half, the SNP have been in charge in Scotland, and despite being the most powerful devolved administration in the world with record budgets, they have overseen failure after failure after failure.
We're such a powerful devolved administration that Westminster can step in and decide if they don't like bits of our legislation passed with all party support, including the support of the Labour Party at Holyrood. She is the towering political figure of the post-war era in Scotland. She goes at a time of her own choosing, enormously popular, with a huge raft of achievements.
John Nicholson, thank you very much. Douglas Ross, thank you for joining us too. Well, Nicola Sturgeon's departure has potentially major implications for the Conservatives, but particularly for Labour, as they seek to claw back the Westminster seats lost to the SNP during her time as leader. Our policy correspondent Paul McNamara is in Westminster now. What's the reaction been there, Paul?
Well, there's been a lot of navel-gazing among Tory MPs trying to work out if this is good or bad for them. And where they all seem to be landing is, well, they can't quite work out if they'll get a few extra votes from this. What they do know is that Labour has the potential to pick up a lot of extra votes. This is potentially very good news for Labour, which means by default it could be bad news for the Conservatives. And among Labour MPs and a fair few people in the shadow cabinet, there is a growing sense of excitement. Look, cast your mind back to just before the general election in 2015. Labour had 41 MPs from Scotland. Today, they've got just one. Now, there's various reasons for that, not least because Labour campaigned to keep the union together during the independence referendum. But, as you heard from Anna Sarwar there is a recognition that part of the popularity, possibly a great big part of the popularity of the SNP over recent years, has been down to Nicola Sturgeon. Now, throw in a different leader, perhaps someone a little bit less well known, someone a little bit less polished on the campaign trail, all at the time while Labour is in the ascendancy, and all of a sudden you've got a lot of Labour MPs telling me that they fancy their chances of taking a dent into SNP territory. There is, of course, one other reason for a bit of extra Labour excitement today, and that's because way before all this kicked off with Nicola Sturgeon this morning at around 9 a.m, the current Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, said that the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, could not stand as a Labour candidate at the next general election. As one MP texted me earlier on, we've got rid of Corbyn, and because we've got rid of Sturgeon on the same day too, nobody's even talking about it. Great.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn could still run as an independent, couldn't we? I mean, couldn't he? Do we know anything about whether he's planning to do that?
Yeah, in the last hour, he's released a statement. He criticises the current Labour leadership. He says it should be down to local Labour members who represents them at an election. It's about 200 words, and what he doesn't do in it is actually...
And that's another story. We actually may cover that coming days, maybe tomorrow. How the resignation, this one is from firstpost.com. How the resignation of Scotland's Nicola Sturgeon is rooted in transgender rights. Scotland First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, who's been in power since 2014, announced her resignation on Wednesday. Her moves come at a time when she feels backlash over a law that allowed trans people to easily change their legal gender. On 15 February, Nicola Sturgeon shocked United Kingdom's politics when she announced that she was standing down as Scottish National Party leader and Scotland's First Minister after 8 years. The 52-year-old leader said she knew in my head and in my heart this was time to step down. The longest-serving First Minister and the first woman said she'd remain in office until her successor was elected. While many dubbed Sturgeon's move as shocking, it didn't really come as a surprise. Her party's poll rating, as well as her own, had been dropping in recent months. Moreover, she faced pressure over her husband, Peter Morell's £107,000 loan to the party. To add to her long list of woes was her relaxed transgender laws, the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. The straw that it seems that broke the camel's back was allowing a rapist to be sent to a female prison. Sturgeon, however, alluding to these in her resignation, said that the decision to quit was not a reaction to short-term pressures, adding that she'd been wrestling with the decision for several weeks now, saying she'd had to consider the physical and mental impact of leading the country after being in charge since 2014. As Scotland now deliberates on their new leader, let's take a closer look at how Sturgeon's transgender policy was her final undoing.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
What was the Gender Recognition Reform Bill? In December last year, the Scottish Parliament passed a bill that would reform the system through which people could apply for their Gender Recognition Certificate, GRC. This new bill lowered the age to apply for the same from 18 to 16. It also eliminated the need for a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. the feeling of distress caused by a mismatch between assigned gender and gender identity, which can be costly and challenging to attain. Applicants above the age of 18 would also be allowed to be recognized in what Scotland calls their acquired gender after 3 months living in it. 16 and 17-year-olds would need to wait 6 months. The bill also provided that people would send their applications to the Registrar General for the Scotland instead of the UK panel. This was a massive change from the previous system in which people had to provide 2 medical reports and live in their acquired gender for 2 years. In passing the bill, the Scottish government, led by Sturgeon, had said that the old system adversely impacted people applying for gender recognition, adding that the process of getting the GRC can be demeaning, intrusive, distressing, and stressful. Supporters of the bill said it would be a simpler and fairer way for transgender men and women to be legally recognized as who they truly were. The Scottish government at the time said that the legislation empowered trans people, giving them more liberty to change their gender. What was the objection to the gender recognition reform bill? While many hailed Sturgeon and her government for the reforms, it wasn't well received by everyone. Some argued that simplification would fundamentally alter who can access women-only services and leave them vulnerable to abuse by predatory male offenders. They argued that the bill could jeopardize women and children's safety, as it would make it easier for men or two men to access single-sex spaces such as bathrooms and changing rooms. J.K. Rowling, the woman behind the Harry Potter series, was perhaps one of the most vocal critics of the bill, saying that the legislation would in effect mean that all man needs to do to become a woman is to say he's one. Even the Rishi Sunak government in Britain blocked the legislation, which it believed was not compatible with the existing Equalities Act. The UK government, Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack, invoked a section of the Scotland Act that allows London to veto Scottish legislation that impacts matters that are considered reserved for the UK Parliament. What was the trans woman rapist row? Even as Sturgeon fumed over Rishi Sunak's government blocking the legislation, calling the move as a frontal attack on our elected Scottish Parliament, she faced a tough time at home over the Isla Bryson case. But who is Isla Bryson, and what was the matter? Isla Bryson, a trans woman formerly known as Adam Graham, was convicted in the late January of raping 2 women in Scotland in 2016 and 2019 and was sent to Cornton Vale Women's Prison in Stirling. Bryson's incarceration at an all-women prison stirred outrage. Many argued that Bryson only decided to declare herself as a trans woman after appearing in court on a rape charge. In fact, Bryson's mother said she was disgusted by Isla's behavior and that she'd given no indication of being transgender as a child. Speaking to the Mail, Janet Bryson had said, "I don't know why it took him until he was in his 20s to say he wanted to become a woman, but I understand why some people think it's just a way of getting out of going to a male prison." Many slammed the Sturgeon government on the matter, with Russell Finlay, a Conservative member of Scottish Parliament, telling Yahoo News, "This rapist decided that he was no longer a man only after appearing in court on a rape charge. We now have the utterly perverse situation where a Scottish court refers to someone who says he identifies as a female using her penis to rape 2 vulnerable women. We warn of the inevitability of this happening if the SNP's gender self-ID law passed, but for it to have become a reality is deeply worrying and an affront to the victims." Following the mass outrage, Bryson was removed from the women's prison. Sturgeon refused 4 times to say whether she thought Bryson was a woman, despite her previous stance on self-identification. But it seemed the damage was done, and we probably saw the effect of it on Wednesday when Sturgeon decided to step down. This is Nigel Farage's take on it.
And that was going to be the big story of the day until rumours went around that Nicola Sturgeon was about to resign as the First Minister in Scotland. Indeed, just after 11 o'clock, she gave her press conference. Interesting that she said I, me, or my 153 times, but only mentioned Scotland 11 times. That, to me, was quite telling. But she's done. She's gone. She pushed it too far. Her trans intransigence, in the end, is what did for her. Yes, quite extraordinary. She wanted 16-year-olds without any medical consultation to be able to change their gender. And then it all happened, didn't it? A male double rapist turns up in court wearing a wig and is due to be sent to a women's prison. And over 80% of Scotland says, no, we don't want that. And Labour start to rise in the polls. Support for separation begins to fall. Stories about SNP money, her own husband's behaviour and non-declaration of loans, and the whole thing unravels, and she's gone. I think it's very good news. It's very good news for those of us who believe in the Christian roots of our society. Very good for those of us that believe in the family as being a rather important unit. Very good news for all of us who believe in small c conservative principles, because we see daily headlines that make us very, very upset, nervous, worried about the future. Yet what you've seen in Scotland is proof that the pendulum can swing back, that actually the silent majority in the end can have their way. So I think it's been a very good day. It's been a very sunny day, and in particular, my view is it's been a particularly good day for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. But tell me, what do you think? How much damage has this done to the cause of Scottish separation? Well, let's go straight to Holyrood and join Darren McCaffrey, GB News' political editor. Darren, a pretty remarkable day for Keir Starmer is my take on.
And George Galloway.
Centrist idiots crying into their oat lattes about the way going of Nicola Sturgeon, for so many long years the First Minister of Scotland, and for many years before that, the Second Minister in Scotland. It seems that she has been with us forever, as we have sunk ever deeper in the social, political and economic malaise that is today's Scotland. Sure, she knew her pronouns, although her new pronouns are was and were. She knew the buttons to push for the liberality in the South and in Europe, but in fact she presided over an almost tyrannical administration in Scotland. And you can see that in the betting for her successor. Nobody else is over 3% because she was all-powerful. She and her rather shadowy husband, one Peter Murrell, who was the General Secretary, is the General Secretary of the ruling party. A husband and wife team not seen since Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu's, though in this case the pants were on the, although you never know, you can't know what's in people's bedrooms. But the shadowy Peter Murrell is currently under police investigation over murky goings-on in the SNP's accounts, where £800,000 were lent to the party by Peter Murrell. A singular decision. Nicola, his wife, knew nothing about it, only from his resources, though where he got those resources will be quite a tall tale to summon. That may have been the reason for her resignation, or it may have been evidence about to emerge in the emails that were inadvertently dropped into a Russian letterbox by the madly anti-Russian NATO fanatic SNP defense spokesman. I've not yet seen the details of what he was doing, putting things through that letterbox, but that is what has happened. Now those emails are stolen property, just like the MP's expenses were stolen property when the Daily Telegraph published them. But sometimes it's in the public interest to publish what you find on stolen property. And Craig Murray, the Honourable Craig Murray, who else? The former ambassador to Uzbekistan is now in full possession of these emails. He's a bosom buddy, perhaps I shouldn't put it that way, of Alex Salmond. And he is ready to publish at least those he and his legal team consider to be in the public interest to publish. Perhaps there's something in those emails that was the proximate reason for Nicola Sturgeon's entirely unexpected, uncharted, and surprise resignation this morning in a 55-minute resignation speech, longer than the resignations of almost any elected officer ever on earth. Nicola Sturgeon got one thing after another wrong. It's not just that Alex Salmond was fitted up by supporters of Nicola Sturgeon, was sent into prison for what might have been the rest of his life, but for the wisdom of a majority women jury at the High Court in Edinburgh, the kind of jury trial that Nicola Sturgeon's government then tried to abolish. Luckily, or you'd never have seen or heard of Alex Salmond again, and she might still be in power. It wasn't just these three things. The 2 ferries that the SNP commissioned have now cost more than the Scottish Parliament building itself. Yet neither is remotely seaworthy. And the shipping scandal is not the worst of it. There's the aluminium smelter scandal that may cost the Scottish people literally billions of pounds over the next 30 years because of the, well, let's be charitable, utterly, shamefully, shamelessly incompetent deal that Nicola Sturgeon drove with a dodgy Indian businessman up there in Invergordon. He's not in Invergordon, of course, but the smelter is. The jobs were supposed to be, but no jobs materialized, and no aluminium either. But it wasn't just those things either. It was not just the so-called hate crimes bill, which, I kid you not, dear viewer, could have seen everybody at my Christmas dinner table prosecuted for hate speech in a private house, in my case, in my own private house. Because amongst many other items of conversation were the issues which may very well have been the final straw for Nicola Sturgeon's government. I refer, of course, to her ludicrous Gender Recognition Act, which inexplicably was not just rammed through, forced through by a nationalist government. One would have thought intent, by definition, on maximizing the number of people in the nation that would unite behind its one single raison d'etre, the independence of Scotland, was not just rammed through by a nationalist government, but was given wings and pushed through almost unanimously by the so-called Labour Party in Scotland, led by a Muslim, and by the so-called Scottish Liberal Party. Even a couple of Conservative members of the Scottish Parliament voted for it. In that Gender Recognition Act, I probably don't need to tell you, men can become women, not by the wave of a wand, but the wag of their tongue, just by saying that they are now a woman, they become a woman. It was cheered to the rafters by all these so-called progressives, but it has run into the wall of the Scottish people's common sense.
What is this nothing you talk about?
The first wall was gender-specific toilets. There's a lot of women, my own wife, my own daughters included, who prefer, thanks very much, to go to a ladies' toilet and don't want to see a man identifying as a woman waving his hopefully flaccid dick around in front of them in the lavatory. And then it was the changing rooms of the swimming pools, where ditto, many women like to swim alone. They certainly like to shower alone. They certainly like to get changed alone, rather than the aforementioned self-declaring women with dicks. The next barrier into which it ran was in shop changing rooms. But the last of the barriers may turn out to have been the most significant. That barrier, and if you think about it, was not just predictable, was not just predicted, but was literally ineluctable, could not possibly be avoided. A double rapist who was a man when he raped 2 women, transitioned, he said, while on remand, and emerged in a blonde wig for his sentencing as a woman, and therefore, under Nicola Sturgeon's law, had to be sent to a women's prison, where presumably the wig would have fallen off, the dick would have been out, and the fellow prisoners and warders would be in danger of being raped, just like the other 2 women that this miserable creature was convicted of raping. First, Nicola Sturgeon into the wall of the Scottish people's common sense. The first wall was gender-specific toilets. There's a lot of women, my own wife, my own daughters included, who prefer, thanks very much, to go to a ladies' toilet and don't want to see a man identifying as a woman waving his hopefully flaccid dick around in front of them in the lavatory. And then it was women like to swim alone. They certainly like to shower alone. Aforementioned self-declaring women with dicks. They shop changing rooms. But the last of the barriers may turn out to have been the most significant. That barrier, and if you think about it, was not just predictable, was not just predicted, but was literally ineluctable, could not possibly be avoided. A double rapist who was a man when he raped 2 women, transitioned, he said, while on remand, and emerged in a blonde wig for his sentencing as a woman, and therefore, under Nicola Sturgeon's law, had to be sent to a woman's prison. The creature was convicted of raping. At first, Nicola Sturgeon stuck to her guns. If she is a woman, then she must be held on the female prison estate. So horrendous was the outcry amongst the Scottish public, the workforce in the jails, the relatives of convicts in the women's jails, that she had to U-turn, except she continued to call him she. She continued to insist that he, the rapist, the double rapist, was a woman and was merely temporarily going to be housed on the male prison estate. you see where all this is going? It's going up the fundament of all the progressives and liberals who've championed this madness right from the beginning. And the parties, plural, the SNP, the Green Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrat Party, who championed it with Nicola Sturgeon, should all be tendering their resignations right now along with hers. I wish I could go into the hatefulness of the supposedly civic nationalism of the SNP, founded by fascist sympathizers in the 1930s, interned for collaborating with Hitler when the Second World War began, later to emerge as the president of the SNP, and every year until now, an award in his honor, the Arthur Donaldson Prize, is given to high Hedians in the Scottish nationalist movement. I wish I could debunk and shake you out of this fatuous, foolish affiliation with Scottish nationalism. Scottish nationalism is no different to any of the other nasty nationalisms in developed imperialist countries. But Nicola Sturgeon and her way going, presumably into the international commentariat or administration in the EU or any of these other NGO hangouts that earn you hundreds of thousands a year, will not be the end of Scottish nationalism, and therefore I will not be able to cease to think and talk about it. But let me turn to the other big issues that are affecting, bigger issues that are affecting all of us today.
And remember that your engagement through a like, a share, and a subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. Watch this space. We'll be back.
It is obvious to the most simple-minded that Lokai is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical. The whole notion of logic.
We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
They should have respected us. The whole notion of logic.
Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger? Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again, which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed. Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist. You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud? Doctor, I am chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
And Zelensky, teaming up with JP Morgan and Blackrock. Here's the story from Breaking Points with Crystal and Sagar.
Part here, it's pretty interesting. Let's put this up there on the screen. This has to do with Ukraine and its dealings with American financial institutions. So here the headline is that Ukraine plots post-war rebuilding effort with JP Morgan Chase as its advisor. So JP Morgan yesterday, in a deal with the country of Ukraine, said that it is going to tap its debt capital market operations payments and commercial banking infrastructure investing expertise to help the country stabilize its economy and credit rating, manage its funds, and advance its digital adoption, whatever that means. What it really means, though, is that JP Morgan is going to work with Ukraine to raise private investment to help rebuild and invest for future growth in Ukraine, including, quote, renewable energy, agriculture, and technology. So outside of the initial things that they say, the reason why I think it's important is that these major Wall Street banks, they are seeing some real profit opportunity here in Ukraine. I mean, I don't know, it's really disgusting to see, but of course, you know, whenever you knock a whole city down after the war, somebody's got to rebuild it, somebody's got to finance it, and it's not just the US government that's getting in on this. Also, Zelensky clearly sees this as a critical avenue, not only with JP Morgan. Just yesterday, he met with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to secure even more loans to the Ukrainian government. Right now, Jamie Dimon is saying that the bank has led a $20 billion debt restructuring for Ukraine last year and has committed millions of dollars of support for Ukrainian refugees. But the reason why this is the prelude to possibly something much grosser and much more nefarious, let's put this next one up there on the screen, is that we had a previous one we were going to cover back in December, but it fits with this very importantly. Zelensky announced an alliance with Blackrock for reconstruction of Ukraine. Now, that Blackrock reconstruction was signed back in December with the CEO, Larry Fink. Blackrock said that rebuilding Ukraine could take, Crystal, between $700 to $800 billion. And they're pointing specifically to the new partnership where they will advise the Ukrainian government on how to structure the country's reconstruction fund. So you could see this is Iraq and Afghanistan levels of graft, if they want it to be. I mean, they're getting their little hands in this one.
I love the way they paint it like they're
restructuring their
humanitarians.
Debt.
You know,
we're going to help them raise. Well, what's your
cause.
fee? And also, the reason why this matters to all of us is, look, Ukraine, they can do whatever they want. But here's the deal. They don't have a real economy. We're the ones who are paying all their bills. We're the ones who are going to guarantee all of their debt. We are literally running their central bank and paying their balancing their budgets right now. Our American taxpayers will be the ones who are basically guaranteeing much of this debt. And how much money are they going to make off of all of these guarantees? And these private investors, they're guaranteeing it might come from the Ukrainian government. That is a de facto bet on the United States government. So we're basically facilitating a massive wealth transfer.
Well,
Yeah.
there's a lot going on here. Western capital has been circling Ukraine like vultures for years now, even before this war. Ukraine already had a lot of debt with IMF. The IMF, of course, is like a tool of imposing, a shock doctrine, and has already forced a bunch of changes to open up the economy so that Western capital could come in and profit off of their agriculture sector as one key example here, because Ukraine, of course, known as the breadbasket of Europe and of the region. Ukraine is a country that, suffered almost more than any and struggled after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's long been a push to, any state-owned enterprises, they need to be privatized. We need to open up markets to Western capital. So this is a more accelerated, more aggressive push in the same direction that they have been pushing for a long time to impose basically like neoliberal shock doctrine of the sort that we have, imposed in lots of places around the world. Zelensky actually gave a speech back at the end of January to the U.S. National Association of State Chambers, where he talked some about this approach and encouraging banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan to come in and be part of this effort. He said, "It's already clear this will be the largest economic project of our time in Europe. It's obvious that American business can become the locomotive that will once again push forward global economic growth." He went on to thank investment firms Blackrock, Goldman Sachs, and JP Morgan. He says, "And everyone can become a big business by working with Ukraine in all sectors, from weapons and defense to construction, from communications to agriculture, from transport to IT, from banks to medicine. And I invite you to work with us right now." I think it's always important to keep an eye on the people who are profiting from a war and from disaster. And very clearly here, the titans of Wall Street are getting their hooks into Ukraine.
And from the New York Post, JP Morgan reaches agreement with Ukraine's Zelensky on rebuilding infrastructure. JP Morgan, the nation's largest bank, has signed a memorandum of understanding with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky with the eye on attracting private capital for a new investment fund to rebuild Ukraine's infrastructure that's been destroyed in its war with Russia, Fox Business has learned. JP Morgan bankers spent most of last week meeting with Zelensky and his senior staff, where they discussed the creation of a fund seeded with $20 billion to $30 billion in private capital, according to people with direct knowledge of the matter. Other ideas discussed with the Ukrainian president were the creation of a bank administered by Wall Street firms that would make investments in oil refineries, roads, bridges, and other pieces of economic infrastructure destroyed in Vladimir Putin's year-long campaign to annex the country and rebuild the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, these people add. JP Morgan bankers were on the ground in Kiev and other cities, dodging bombs and witnessing firsthand how the war has crippled the country's economy. After a series of meetings with various ministers, they met directly with Zelensky on Friday night. As a gesture of goodwill on the eve of Sunday's Super Bowl, the bankers also presented Zelensky with a New England Patriot jersey with a number 91, signify the year Ukraine gained independence from the old Soviet Union. Fox Business is the first to report the possible creation of an investment fund and bank to help rebuild the country. People with knowledge of the matter say the plans for a fund or bank are in the nascent stages and subject to change. JP Morgan declined to comment. The big bank's expected to make an announcement about its work in Ukraine on Monday. A representative for Zelensky couldn't be immediately reached for comment. The Russian invasion has been thwarted by stiff resistance from Ukrainians with assistance of billions of dollars in U.S. and Western aid. Still, Russia is said to control around 15% of the country, mostly in the east. While the Russian military has suffered significant casualties, its bombing of key cities, such as Ukraine's capital Kiev, as well as civilian and infrastructure targets, has devastated the Ukrainian economy. The country is said to have 30% unemployment rate, even with men between the ages of 18 and 60 required to remain in the country to join the military or be subject to conscription. Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan's chief executive, has been particularly vocal about the consequences of the conflict, calling it an inflection point for the Western world for 100 years. Do we get our act together to help win this war, help the Ukrainians help rebuild Ukraine? Diamond also believes attracting private capital will be key to Ukraine's ability to fight off Russian aggression. Zelensky announced last week he would join the bank's online investment summit with other major bank clients. Privately, JP Morgan bankers met with Zelensky for hours last week, providing him with ideas on how to attract private capital. They also recommended that he invite major CEOs like Apple's Tim Cook to the country to discuss economic development, that he meet with GOP lawmakers such as the new House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Some Republicans are skeptical about the billions in U.S. aid being sent to the country, these people add. They also said that the weeding out corruption and eliminating graft in government will be key to attracting private capital. Zelensky was said to be receptive to the advice and understood that at some point the vast amounts of Western aid to the country will come to an end, and that private capital, which will demand a return for its investment, will be needed to rebuild, these people say. Wall Street's long had its sights on helping rebuild Ukraine, eyeing future investment opportunities as the country moves beyond its war with Russia. Blackrock, the world's largest money manager, has signed a memorandum of understanding with Zelensky as an investment advisor, and Goldman Sachs is also said to be eyeing opportunities. And also, we have, and I guess we could play this as well. This is an update on the Israeli government watch, and actually this one is by way of Mike Pompeo in a recent statement.
Obviously, the Abraham Accords were really, really important to you. You write at length in your book about your close ties to the Israelis and particularly your close relationship with the head of Mossad, Yossi Cohen. Very Saul Berenson, Tova Rivlin vibes in that section of your book. You spoke a lot about working
You're quite
with...
the historian.
Yeah. You spoke quite a lot about working with Netanyahu, who is, of course, back in power. Now, he said around 10 years ago, without a strong and independent Supreme Court, there can be no protection of rights. It's what makes the difference between dictatorships and democracies. Mike, I wanted to ask you, because as you know, for more than a month now in Israel, there have been protests against the judicial reform plans that would give Netanyahu greater control of appointments to the bench. It would weaken the Supreme Court's ability to strike down legislation or rule against the executive. People say Bibi is doing this because he's currently on trial on corruption charges, which he denies. Do the protesters have a point? Is Netanyahu straying from the path of democracy? And this is a really important question to ask you, because as someone who may run for the office of the presidency, it's important to know if you feel that American friendship and allyship is conditional upon adherence to democratic principles and shared values, even with our friends.
Oh, look, we always push for that everywhere, but we also are partners and friends with nations that aren't democracies. We were talking about the relationships we have in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. These aren't democracies. They have a system that is fundamentally different than ours. The Israelis are one of the most democratic nations in the world, and that they'll continue at it. And this to and fro, these protests you're seeing, we've had protests at our Supreme Court too. People are entitled to their own views. They had, during our time, we had 5 governments in Israel at different times. I don't want to get in the center of Israeli politics. That relationship is absolutely vital to us. It's why I wrote about it, because it was the linchpin of delivering good things for America. You said I was happy about the Abraham Accords for me personally. That's not remotely true. I'm happy about the Abraham Accords because the chance that a young U.S. Marine will have to fight and die in the Middle East someday is substantially lower now that peace and prosperity are on the march in the region. And, I wish we'd had more time and gotten further, but we fundamentally took down risk for the United States of America as a result of the Abraham Accords. And I'm incredibly happy that the leaders in those 4 countries, in the United States, all the people who made this happen, Mr. Kushner, Secretary Mnuchin, everybody on our team that worked on this, we now know that if you're a mom or dad here in the United States and your son or daughter goes to a recruiting station, that the risk they'll have to go to that place and fight for something is lower. And that's just unequivocally good for us. And I'm very confident good for the region too.
I appreciate that. You told the Senate critiquing a policy that Israel undertakes is part of our democratic process. I'll ask you again.
Sure.
Is Netanyahu wrong?
Look, I try to stay out of domestic politics, but when any country gets a policy that is inconsistent with something that's good for my country, we're gonna say, hey, here's what we think. Here's what we would prefer you do. But if you look at the list of troubles we have in the Middle East, let me tell you, that doesn't make the hit parade. Let's start with the fact that the Iranians continue to hold people with U.S. passports and British passports. Let's start with the fact that today the Iranians are trying to kill Americans here at home, including former U.S. senior government officials. So when you prioritize and you only write 400 pages, you got to rank them.
I appreciate that. Let me ask you a question about US policy then, because as Secretary of State, you undid the Hansel memo that called Jewish settlements in the West Bank against international law. And the reason you gave in subsequent interviews was because you said Israel was not an occupying nation. Now, I've not been able to find you stating on the record your support for a 2-state solution. Mike, can I ask you if you support Israel annexing the remaining areas of the West Bank, if you support a 1-state solution, and if Palestinians should be offered a path to citizenship in order for Israel to continue calling itself a democratic state?
Well, it is a democratic state. It is not an occupying nation. This land, as an evangelical Christian, I am convinced from my reading of the Bible that 3,000 years on now, in spite of the denial of so many, is the rightful homeland of the Jewish people. And we should support Israel in its efforts. They'll find their own way to an outcome there. It may take much longer. Our theory of the case was this: what's in America's best interest? Is it to sit and wait for Abu Mazen, a known terrorist who's killed lots and lots of people, including Americans, and given those martyrs money for having done so, to try and wait around for Abu Mazen to draw a line on a map? Look, that's what the State Department would do. Previous Secretary of State ran back and forth from Tel Aviv to Ramallah and tried to draw lines on a map. We said that's not in America's best interest. Let's go create peace, and we did. And they'll have to sort their way through what are very difficult geographical problems, very difficult national security problems. I concede all of those things.
And just to be clear, Abu Mazen is Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. I think he just called the president of the Palestinian Authority a terrorist.
But in the meantime, we should look out for Europe and America and make sure that we are helping these nations get to the right place. And we want good things for everyone, including those folks that live in Judea and Samaria.
2-state solution then? Do you support a 2-state solution?
I'm for an outcome that guarantees Israeli security and makes the lives better for everyone in the region.
Can Israel have that within a 2-state solution, Mike?
Only time and history and the Lord will know the answer to that.
That's good answer.
I wish I had a better answer than that, but many have founded on this problem said, as we're working our way towards that answer, we should work to deliver better outcomes for all the people of the region, and we unequivocally deliver that.
One more question is, what lesson do you think America, in all your travels as Secretary of State, what lesson can America learn from its allies? What did you see overseas?
Okay, and that'll be all for today. We will see you tomorrow. I'm going to open a channel here. Watch this space.
Beam me up, Mr. Spark. Beam me up. Lock on transporters. Beam us up. Beam us up. Quickly. Beam us up home. Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Scott, prepare to beam us up. Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast. Stand by to beam us up. Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.